Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The brass nameplate outside read, Pemberton Arms, Esther 1952. But the building felt much older than that, like something that had been waiting decades for someone like me to notice it. I should have paid attention to that feeling. Should have questioned why a place in downtown Boston's historic district was going for $800 a month when everything else in the neighborhood started at twice that. But when you're 35 and starting over after your life implodes, you don't ask too many questions about good fortune. The apartment was on the 4th floor. The top floor, Mrs. Kellerman assured me, as she handed over the keys, with fingers that trembled slightly. She was the building manager, a woman in her 70s who spoke in clipped sentences and avoided my eyes when I asked about the previous tenant. The hallway smelled of old wood polish and something else, something metallic that caught in the back of my throat. "Heat's included," she said, turning toward the elevator. "Building's quiet. Good for someone who works with numbers." I'd mentioned being an accountant during our brief phone conversation, though I hadn't told her I was currently between jobs. Between everything, really. The divorce had finalized 3 months ago, taking with it not just Sarah but the house, half my savings, and most of my certainty about who I was. Boston was supposed to be a fresh start, though standing in that dim hallway, fresh felt like the wrong word entirely. The apartment itself was decent enough. 1 bedroom, hardwood floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot, tall windows that looked out over the common. The kitchen was small, but functional. The bathroom clean, if dated. Everything had an oddly preserved quality, as if it had been maintained but not truly lived in for years. I found myself walking softly, though I couldn't say why. That first night, I set up my laptop on the kitchen table and tried to focus on the freelance work I'd managed to pick up. Tax preparation for a small firm that didn't ask too many questions about my credentials. The numbers blurred together after an hour, and I found myself listening to the building's sounds. The wheeze of old pipes, the settling of wood, the distant hum of traffic outside. I was reaching for my coffee cup when I heard them. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps directly above my head, moving from what would have been the living room toward the bedroom. The sound was unmistakable, the measured pace of someone walking with purpose, each step accompanied by a slight creak of floorboards. I glanced at my watch, 3:33 a.m. My first thought was that Mrs. Kellerman had been mistaken about the building's layout. Maybe there was a 5th floor, some kind of converted attic space she'd forgotten to mention. The steps continued for maybe 2 minutes, then stopped abruptly. I waited, counting my heartbeats, but heard nothing more. The next morning I walked the building's perimeter, craning my neck to count the floors. 4 stories, exactly as I'd been told, with a steep mansard roof above. No windows in the roofline, no obvious way to access whatever space might exist up there. When I mentioned the footsteps to Mrs. Kellerman, she paused in sorting through a stack of mail, her shoulders tensing. "Old buildings make noise," she said without looking up. "Pipes expanding, wood settling, you'll get used to it." But when 3:33 a.m. arrived the second night, I was waiting. The footsteps came again, the same deliberate pattern, the same duration. This time I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the building's common areas, looking for any access to the space above. The hallways were empty, lit by buzzing fluorescent fixtures that cast everything in sickly yellow. I found a maintenance door at the end of the hall, but it was locked, and my exploration yielded nothing but the growing sense that I was being watched by the building itself. On the 3rd night, I positioned myself directly under where the steps seemed loudest and followed their movement with my eyes on the ceiling. They started near the center of what would be the living room, moved toward the back corner, where a bedroom would be, then stopped. Always stopped. I began timing them. The sequence lasted exactly 2 minutes and 14 seconds. The pattern continued for a week. Always 3:33 a.m. Always the same route. Always the same duration. I started researching the building's history during my lunch breaks. digging through city records and old newspaper archives. The Pemberton Arms had indeed been built in 1952, constructed on the site of an older tenement that had been demolished after a fire. Nothing unusual in the records, though. I noticed that apartment 5A, the space directly above mine, had been listed as vacant in the building directory for the past 8 years. But apartment 5A shouldn't exist. The building only had 4 floors. I brought this discrepancy to Mrs. Kellerman's attention during a chance encounter in the lobby. She was collecting mail, moving with the careful precision of someone whose balance wasn't quite reliable. When I mentioned the apartment number, she fumbled the key to the mailboxes, and they clattered to the floor with a sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have. "Must be an old listing," she said, bending to retrieve them with obvious difficulty. "Clerical error. Buildings get renumbered sometimes." But I'd seen the way her hands shook when I mentioned 5A, had noticed how she avoided looking at the ceiling when the topic came up. That night, I waited until well past midnight, then made my way to the building's top floor with a pen light and a growing sense of purpose that felt less like curiosity and more like compulsion. The 4th floor hallway was identical to mine, but at the far end, past where the regular apartments ended, I found something that shouldn't have been there. A narrow door marked with faded numbers. 5A. The door was painted the same institutional green as the others, but the paint was older, more weathered. When I pressed my ear against it, I could swear I heard something. A faint electrical hum, like an old radio tuned between stations. The door was locked, but locks had never been much of a challenge for someone who'd spent his teenage years getting into places he shouldn't. It took me 15 minutes with a credit card and a hairpin to work the mechanism free. The door swung open with a groan that seemed to come from the building's bones. The smell hit me first. Not decay or mustiness, but something clean and preserved, like air that had been sealed away and forgotten. My pen light revealed a narrow staircase leading up into darkness. Each step felt like a descent despite the upward direction, and by the time I reached the top, my hands were shaking enough that the light beam danced across the walls. What I found defied every expectation I'd built over the past week. It was an apartment, fully furnished and arranged as if someone had simply stepped out for the evening in 1955 and never returned. The living room held a pristine sofa in mint green vinyl, a coffee table with perfectly arranged magazines, Life, Look, Popular Mechanics, all dating from the mid-50s. The walls were painted in colors that spoke of optimism and atomic age dreams. Soft yellow, pale blue, cheerful pink. Everything was clean, dust-free, preserved in a way that seemed impossible. But it was the details that made my skin crawl. The magazines weren't just arranged. They were open to specific pages. Popular Mechanics displayed an article about fallout shelters. Life showed photographs of nuclear tests. Look featured a piece about Soviet infiltration of American institutions. Every publication dealt with the Cold War, with the paranoia and fear that had defined that era. I moved through the space like a sleepwalker, my flashlight beam revealing room after room of this perfectly preserved anxiety. The bedroom contained a single bed with military-precise corners, a dresser topped with men's toiletries from brands I didn't recognize. The closet held suits in a style that had been out of fashion for decades, each one pressed and hanging at exact intervals. But it was the kitchen that broke something inside me. The radio sat on the counter, a massive Philco model from the early 50s, its dial glowing faintly green in the darkness. As I approached, static began to whisper from its speakers. Not the random hiss of an untuned signal, but something with pattern, with intent. I found myself leaning closer, trying to parse meaning from the electronic snow. Then the voices began. They emerged from the static gradually, like figures walking out of fog. Multiple voices, speaking in urgent, clipped tones about missile gaps and infiltration protocols, and dead drops in Central Park. The conversations had the rhythm of official communications, but underneath them was something else. A tension that felt personal, immediate, real. I reached for the radio's power switch, but my hand froze when I realized the cord wasn't plugged in. The radio was receiving these signals without any power source I could identify, pulling them from the air itself or from somewhere deeper than that. The footsteps above my head began again, But now I was above my head, standing in the apartment that shouldn't exist, listening to conversations from a war that had ended decades ago while something heavier than human feet paced the ceiling above me. The sound was different up here, not the measured steps I'd grown accustomed to, but something urgent, panicked, like someone searching for an exit that wouldn't be found. I backed toward the staircase, but the voices from the radio grew louder, more insistent. They were discussing someone, a man, a sleeper agent, someone who'd been activated after years of dormancy. The details were fragmentary, filtered through decades of static, but certain phrases cut through with crystal clarity. Subject exhibits increasing paranoia, reality distortion consistent with activation protocol, monitoring essential. The footsteps above intensified, joined now by other sounds, drawers opening and closing, papers rustling, the squeak of bed springs under sudden weight. Whatever was up there was searching for something, or someone, with growing desperation. I ran. The staircase seemed longer going down, each step echoing with a metallic ring that followed me into the hallway. I fumbled with the door to 5A, my hands slick with sweat that felt cold against my skin. By the time I reached my own apartment, my heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my temples. But the radio voices followed me. They whispered from my kitchen radio, my alarm clock, even from my laptop speakers, though the device wasn't connected to any network. The conversations were different now, more focused, discussing surveillance protocols and psychological evaluation. They mentioned an address, my address, and a subject who was beginning to understand his purpose. I unplugged every electronic device in the apartment, but the voices continued, emanating from the walls themselves, from the very structure of the building. They spoke of long-term observation, of deep cover operations that spanned decades, of subjects who didn't know they were subjects until the moment of activation. Sleep became impossible. I spent the following days researching everything I could find about government programs from the Cold War era, MKUltra, COINTELPRO, projects with names I'd never heard, and documentation that led to dead ends and classified files. The more I learned, the more the pieces seemed to fit a pattern I didn't want to recognize. My marriage had ended suddenly, Sarah claiming I'd become paranoid and suspicious without cause. My job had disappeared after what my supervisor called concerning behavioral changes. My decision to move to Boston had felt spontaneous, but now I couldn't remember making it, only that I'd found myself here, drawn to this specific building, this specific apartment, as if following instructions I'd never consciously received. The voices from the radio spoke of sleeper agents activated by trauma, by isolation, by carefully orchestrated life disruptions that would leave subjects vulnerable to embedded programming. They discussed the Pemberton Arms as a monitoring station, a place where subjects could be observed during their final activation phase. But the most terrifying part was how logical it all sounded. I began finding evidence everywhere, patterns in my daily routine that followed protocols mentioned in the radio broadcasts, responses to situations that felt programmed rather than chosen. My apartment contained items I didn't remember purchasing, a specific brand of coffee mentioned in the transmissions, clothes in colors and styles that matched descriptions of subject preferences, books on topics that aligned with the psychological profiles being discussed in those whispered conversations. The footsteps above continued every night at 3:33 a.m., but now I understood they weren't coming from above. They were coming from inside, from the part of my mind that had been waiting 35 years for activation, for the moment when I would finally understand what I really was. Yet some stubborn part of me refused to accept this explanation. The rational mind of an accountant, trained to spot discrepancies and question inconsistencies, kept pointing out the flaws in this narrative. How could radio signals from the 1950s still be broadcasting? How could a government program have maintained such elaborate surveillance for decades? How could any of this be real? But then I would catch my reflection in the mirror and notice how my posture had changed, how I moved with a precision that felt practiced rather than natural. I would find myself following routes through the city that I'd never walked before but somehow knew by heart. I would speak in languages I didn't remember learning, recall events from a childhood that felt like someone else's memories. The building itself seemed to be watching now, responding to my growing awareness with subtle changes. Doors that had been locked stood open when I passed. Shadows moved in windows that should have been empty. The elevator stopped at floors that didn't exist, opening onto hallways that stretched into darkness beyond the reach of any light. Mrs. Kellerman had stopped making eye contact entirely, hurrying past when she saw me in the lobby, her hands trembling worse than before. Once, I caught her speaking into an old rotary phone in the building's office, her voice too low to make out words, but her tone urgent, frightened. Last night, the pattern changed. The footsteps came not at 3:33 a.m., but throughout the night, accompanied by voices that seemed to emanate from every surface in the apartment. They were no longer discussing protocols or observation. They were giving orders, instructions for actions I found myself wanting to take, but couldn't quite understand. I write this now as morning light filters through windows that seem dimmer than they should be, in an apartment that feels less real with each passing hour. The radio in the kitchen has been silent since dawn, but I can feel its presence, waiting for the right moment to resume its broadcast. The footsteps above have stopped, but only because whatever was pacing up there has finally found what it was looking for. The truth is, I no longer know if I'm the observer or the observed, the investigator or the subject under investigation. Every explanation I construct, government conspiracy, supernatural haunting, psychological breakdown, feels both completely logical and utterly impossible. The building holds its secrets like a patient parent, waiting for me to understand what I've always been. But understanding and accepting are different things, and some part of me, the part that still remembers being a man named David, who worked with numbers and married a woman named Sarah, refuses to let go entirely. That part keeps asking questions, keeps looking for evidence, keeps insisting that reality should make sense even when it clearly doesn't. Tonight, I'll be listening again at 3:33 a.m., though I'm no longer certain if I'll be listening from above or below, if I'll be the one making the footsteps or the one hearing them. The voices from the radio have promised to explain everything, to show me the final piece of a puzzle I've been solving my entire life without knowing it. But until that moment comes, I remain suspended between possibilities. A man who might be an accountant having a breakdown, or a sleeper agent finally waking up, or something else entirely that exists in the space between those two truths. The building knows which one is real, but it's not telling yet. And perhaps that's the most terrifying thing of all, that the answer when it comes might be something I've been programmed to accept without question. Story 2. The first time I noticed the delay, I blamed my exhaustion. 42 years of cutting hair in Millbrook, Maine, and I'd never seen anything like it. The old mirror that dominated the back wall of my shop had been there since my grandfather's time. A massive silver-backed glass that stretched nearly floor to ceiling, its ornate bronze frame worn smooth by decades of hands steadying nervous customers. That Tuesday morning in October, as I raised my scissors to trim Mrs. Henderson's gray curls, my reflection lagged behind by what couldn't have been more than a heartbeat. A split second where my real hand moved, but the mirrored one remained frozen, creating an impossible moment of disconnection. I blinked hard, the way you do when your eyes are dry and tired, and everything snapped back to normal. The reflection caught up, moving in perfect synchronization as it always had. Mrs. Henderson chattered on about her grandson's college plans, oblivious to my moment of confusion. I convinced myself it was nothing. Too much coffee, not enough sleep, the stress of keeping a small business afloat in a town where young people fled like birds before winter. But the delay happened again the next day. This time it lasted longer, maybe 2 full seconds, while I lathered shaving cream onto old Mr. Cartwright's weathered cheeks. In the mirror, I watched my hand move through the air, painting white foam across his jaw, while my reflection stood motionless, brush suspended in space like a photograph. The sensation was nauseating, like watching yourself on a television with bad reception, the audio and video gradually drifting out of sync. Mr. Cartwright must have noticed my hands trembling because he asked if I was feeling all right. I mumbled something about needing to adjust the shop's heating, but my skin felt clammy despite the October chill seeping through the windows. By the end of that week, the delay had stretched to nearly 5 seconds. I began timing it obsessively, counting Mississippis under my breath while my reflection fell further and further behind. The worst part wasn't the delay itself, but the moment when it caught up, a jerky, unnatural acceleration where my mirror self seemed to sprint through the missing seconds, movements blurring together in a rush to synchronize. I started avoiding direct looks at the mirror during work, focusing instead on my customers' faces, their hair, anything but that silver surface that reflected everything except the present moment. But peripheral vision betrayed me constantly. I'd catch glimpses of my delayed double, always a few seconds behind, like a ghost of my immediate past haunting the edges of my sight. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in bed above the shop, listening to the old building settle and creak, wondering if I should see a doctor. Stress could cause hallucinations, I'd read that somewhere. Or maybe it was a brain tumor pressing against my optic nerve, distorting my perception in impossible ways. But even as I tried to rationalize what was happening, a deeper dread had taken root in my chest. The feeling that something fundamental about my world had shifted, that the natural order of things was quietly unraveling. The first time I saw my reflection move independently, I was closing up shop on a gray Thursday evening in late October. I'd finished sweeping the black and white checkered floor, had counted the day's modest earnings, and was reaching for the light switch when movement in the mirror caught my eye. My reflection was still sweeping, long after I'd set the broom aside. Not the jerky catch-up motion I'd grown accustomed to, but smooth, deliberate strokes across a floor that was already clean. I stood frozen by the door, watching myself, or something that looked exactly like me, continue an action I'd completed minutes earlier. The reflection's face held the same concentration I'd felt while actually sweeping, brow slightly furrowed, lips pressed together in the unconscious expression I made when focused on mundane tasks. When my mirror self finally set down the broom, it didn't look toward the door where I stood. Instead, it turned to face the empty barber chair and nodded, as if acknowledging someone seated there. Its mouth moved in what appeared to be conversation, though I heard nothing but the whisper of wind through the window frames and the distant hum of the streetlight outside. I wanted to run, to flee upstairs and lock myself in my apartment until morning brought reason back to the world. But something kept me rooted in place, a morbid fascination with this impossible theater playing out in reverse space. My reflection gestured toward the chair, picked up scissors that weren't there in the real shop, and began cutting air with the precise, practiced movements I'd performed thousands of times on actual customers. The performance lasted nearly 10 minutes. When it finally ended, my reflection looked directly at me through the glass, its eyes meeting mine with an intensity that sent ice water through my veins. For that brief moment, I felt like I was the reflection, like I was the one trapped behind silver, watching some other version of myself live in the real world. Then the mirror went dark, as clouds passed over the streetlight outside, and when illumination returned, my reflection was gone entirely. I spent the next 3 days working without mirrors. I draped a sheet over the large glass, telling customers that it had developed a crack and was being repaired. Most didn't seem to care. The handful of regulars who still frequented my old-fashioned shop were more interested in conversation than checking their appearance. But working without the mirror felt like performing surgery while blindfolded. My hands, trained by decades of watching myself in that silvered surface, fumbled with familiar tools. I gave Mr. Patterson a slightly uneven haircut and nicked Dr. Morrison's ear while shaving him, drawing a tiny bead of blood that made my hands shake for the rest of the afternoon. By Sunday, I couldn't stand it anymore. The sheet came down. The delay was gone. For one glorious moment, I thought whatever strangeness had infected my shop had passed like a fever breaking. My reflection moved in perfect harmony with my body, synchronized and normal and wonderfully mundane. I almost wept with relief. That relief lasted exactly 47 seconds. When the independence returned, it came with a vengeance that made the previous incidents seem quaint by comparison. This time, my reflection didn't just move on its own, it moved counter to my actions. When I reached for my scissors, it set them down. When I turned to face the front of the shop, it turned toward the back. When I smiled tentatively, testing whether I still had control over our shared face, it frowned back at me with unmistakable displeasure. The opposing movements created a dizzy, nauseating sensation, like being seasick on dry land. I found myself fighting my own reflection, my real body pulling against some invisible resistance, as my mirror self worked to thwart every motion. It was exhausting, like arm wrestling an opponent of exactly equal strength, a contest that could go on forever, with neither side gaining advantage. But the opposition was just the beginning. Over the following days, my reflection began showing me things that weren't there. It would point toward empty corners of the shop, its face animated with surprise or concern, as if seeing customers I couldn't perceive. Sometimes it would back away from something approaching in the mirror world, hands raised defensively, eyes wide with what looked like fear. The most disturbing incidents occurred when it tried to communicate with me directly. My reflection would lean close to the glass from its side, mouth moving urgently as if trying to warn me about something. Its hands would press against the surface, fingers splayed wide, and I could swear I felt a cold pressure against my side of the mirror, as if something were trying to push through from the other side. I began keeping a notebook, documenting each incident with the desperate precision of a scientist recording an impossible experiment. The entries grew longer and more frantic as the occurrences intensified. October 28th. Reflection pointed to southeast corner for 37 minutes straight. Nothing visible in real corner. Kept looking at me, then at corner, growing more agitated. October 30th. Mirror self spent entire afternoon cutting hair of invisible customers. Appeared to be having animated conversations. At one point, seemed to laugh at something. No sound audible on this side. November 1st. Reflection tried to write something on the glass. When mirror fogged from heat, saw backwards letters forming. Get out. Wiped condensation immediately. When it cleared, reflection was gone. The warning messages became more frequent after that. During the morning rush of steam from my coffee maker, during the brief fog created when someone opened the door on cold days, my reflection would write frantically on its side of the glass. Always backwards, always urgent. Help. Trapped. Not safe. I began to understand that whatever was happening, my reflection, or the consciousness inhabiting it, was trying to warn me about something. But warn me about what? And if it was trapped, what did that make me? The question haunted my increasingly sleepless nights. I would pace the small apartment above my shop, listening to the building's night sounds and wondering if I was losing my mind. The rational part of my brain, the part that had run a successful business for 2 decades, that paid taxes and voted in local elections and lived a perfectly ordinary life, insisted that stress had finally broken something essential in my perception. People had breakdowns all the time. This was just mine taking a particularly vivid, specific form. But rationality became harder to maintain as November deepened and the incidents grew more intense. The breakthrough came on a gray Tuesday morning when Mrs. Kellerman stopped by for her monthly trim. She was a chatty woman in her 70s, one of the few customers who still came regularly despite the way my hands had begun to shake whenever I worked near the mirror. As I sectioned her silver hair, preparing to trim the ends, I noticed my reflection wasn't moving with me at all. Instead, it stood perfectly still in the center of the mirror shop, staring out at me with an expression of desperate urgency. Its mouth was moving rapidly, hands gesturing frantically, but I'd learned that trying to read its lips only gave me headaches. Mrs. Kellerman was describing her daughter's recent visit from Portland when my reflection suddenly stopped its frantic pantomime and pointed directly at her. Not at where she sat in the real chair, but at a spot slightly to the left, as if someone else were sitting in the mirror world's version of my shop. That's when I heard it. A voice, faint but distinct, speaking words I couldn't quite make out. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, like sound traveling through water. Mrs. Kellerman continued talking, oblivious, but I stood frozen with scissors halfway to her hair, straining to catch the phantom words. The voice grew clearer. Help me. Please. Mrs. Kellerman's reflection, I realized with a chill that penetrated to my bones, was speaking to my reflection. Two mirror selves having a conversation I could barely hear while their real-world counterparts remained completely unaware. I managed to finish the haircut through pure muscle memory, my hands moving automatically while my mind reeled with implications. If Mrs. Kellerman had a reflection that could speak independently, then everyone did. Every customer who had sat in my chair over the past month had brought their own trapped mirror self into my shop, all of them existing in some parallel version of reality, where they could see and hear each other while their real-world bodies remained ignorant. After Mrs. Kellerman left, I stood alone in my shop, staring at my reflection with new understanding. It looked back at me with relief, as if it knew I was finally beginning to comprehend. That night, I made a decision that terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. I would try to make contact. I waited until well after midnight, when the streets outside were empty, and the only light came from the old fluorescent fixture that hummed overhead like an anxious insect. Standing before the mirror, I pressed my palms against the cool glass and spoke directly to my reflection. "I know you can hear me," I whispered to the darkened shop. "I know you're trying to tell me something." My reflection's mouth moved in perfect synchronization with mine, but a split second later, it continued moving, speaking words I wasn't saying. The voice that emerged was my own, yet not my own, distorted as if traveling through layers of glass and time. "You have to understand," my reflection said, its voice barely audible but growing stronger. "This isn't just happening to you. Everyone has been split. Everyone has a part of themselves trapped here, in the mirror world." "Trapped how?" I asked aloud, feeling foolish but desperate for answers. "We don't know when it started. Time works differently here. Days, weeks, maybe months. We've been trying to warn you, all of you, but no one sees. No one hears." The conversation continued for nearly an hour. My reflection explained that the mirror world was like a shadow of reality, populated by the consciousness of everyone who had ever looked into a reflective surface in my shop. They could see each other, interact, but they were powerless to affect the real world except in the smallest ways. The delays, the independent movements, the desperate messages written in fog. "Something is coming," my reflection warned, as our conversation neared its end. "Something that feeds on the split between worlds. The more people who become aware of us, the stronger it grows. And when it's strong enough." When it's strong enough, what? But my reflection was already fading, its voice growing distant as if receding down a long tunnel. "Don't let it—" The words cut off abruptly as my reflection suddenly lurched backward, away from the glass, its face twisted with terror. It was fighting something I couldn't see, struggling against invisible forces that seemed to be dragging it away from the mirror's surface. I pressed harder against the glass, shouting questions that received no answers. My reflection's mouth opened in what might have been a scream, but no sound reached me. Its hand slapped against its side of the mirror, leaving no marks on my side, and then it was gone. Not faded, not slowly disappeared, but yanked away as if by enormous, unseen hands. The mirror reflected only my own terrified face, alone in the fluorescent-lit shop. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. I sat vigil before the mirror, waiting for my reflection to return. But the glass showed only what it should. My own image, moving in perfect synchronization, normal and mundane, and utterly conventional. 3 days passed before I accepted that my reflection, the conscious part of me that had been trying to warn me, was gone. Whatever had taken it left behind only the basic mirror function, the simple optical phenomenon that bounced light back without consciousness or intent. But I wasn't the same. The knowledge my reflection had shared, that everyone carried a hidden part of themselves trapped in the mirror world, that something was feeding on the split between realities, haunted every waking moment. I began watching my customers' reflections obsessively, looking for signs of independent movement, for evidence that their mirror selves were still fighting to be heard. I found nothing. Every reflection moved in perfect harmony with its real-world body, synchronized and normal. Either the phenomenon had ended, or I was now the only one who could see it. The doubt gnawed at me constantly. Had any of it been real? Was I simply experiencing an elaborate mental breakdown, complete with auditory and visual hallucinations that had constructed an entire mythology around a broken mind's inability to process reality? I might have convinced myself it was all delusion, if not for what happened the following Monday. Mr. Patterson came in for his weekly trim, settling into the barber chair with his usual complaints about the weather and the town council's latest decisions. As I draped the cape around his shoulders and reached for my scissors, I glanced automatically at the mirror. Mr. Patterson's reflection was there, moving in perfect synchronization with his real body. But for just a moment, so brief I almost missed it, I saw something else in the glass, a shadow behind his reflection, a dark shape that moved independently of any light source in the room. The shape had too many angles, geometry that hurt to look at directly. It stood behind Mr. Patterson's mirror self like a predator studying prey, occasionally reaching out with appendages that weren't quite arms to touch the reflection's shoulders with what might have been hunger or ownership. I blinked, and the shadow was gone. Mr. Patterson's reflection appeared normal, unconscious, unaware of whatever had been lurking behind it in the mirror world. But I knew what I had seen. My reflection had been right. Something was feeding on the split between worlds. And now that the mirror selves had been silenced, that something was growing stronger, moving closer to the surface. I continue cutting hair in my shop, maintain the facade of normalcy that keeps the people of Millbrook comfortable and unaware. But I watch the mirrors constantly now, searching for glimpses of the shadows that move behind our reflections. Sometimes I catch them, dark shapes that exist only in peripheral vision, entities that vanish the moment I look directly at them. I've tried to warn people, tried to explain what I've seen, but the few attempts I've made have been met with concerned suggestions that I take a vacation, maybe see a doctor. So I remain silent, the only sentinel in a town full of people who don't know they're being watched by things that shouldn't exist. The worst part is the uncertainty that follows me everywhere. The persistent question that threatens to drive me to madness. Am I the only one who can see the truth? Or am I the only one who's lost his grip on reality? Late at night, when I lie in bed listening to the old buildings settle around me, I sometimes feel watched. Not by anything visible, but by something that exists just outside the edge of perception, something that feeds on doubt and grows stronger with each person who questions their own sanity. And in the morning, when I look into my bathroom mirror while shaving, I see only my own face staring back, synchronized, normal, empty of any consciousness beyond my own. I can't decide which possibility terrifies me more, that everything I experienced was real, or that none of it was. The mirror reflects both possibilities with equal clarity, and I remain trapped between them, never knowing which world I truly inhabit. Story 3. The service call came in at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that felt like it had been stretched thin, like old taffy left too long in the sun. Elevator malfunction at the Meridian building on West Madison. Nothing unusual there. Half the elevators in Chicago's forgotten towers had been breaking down since the city started hemorrhaging money in the 80s. What made this one different was the address. I'd been maintaining elevators for 15 years, and I'd never heard of the Meridian building. The structure loomed against the October sky like a granite tombstone, its Art Deco facade blackened by decades of Chicago wind and neglect. 32 floors of abandoned ambition, windows either boarded up or reflecting nothing but clouds, and the occasional pigeon. The lobby smelled of water damage and something else. Something sweet and cloying that reminded me of flowers left too long in a vase. My footsteps echoed against marble that had once gleamed, but now wore a patina of dust and indifference. The building directory hung crooked near the elevator bank, most of the tenant names obscured by age and vandalism. I could make out fragments, Eagle Associates, Meridian Import, and something that might have been Dimensional Research Corp. The rest dissolved into scratches and time. The elevator in question was the middle car of 3, its brass doors tarnished to the color of old pennies. The complaint had been specific: Elevator stops at unauthorized floors, doors open to empty shafts. Probably a wiring issue in the control panel, maybe a short in the floor selector. Standard stuff. I popped the control panel and immediately knew something was wrong. The wiring was immaculate, not just well-maintained, but pristine. Copper gleamed like it had been installed yesterday, connections tight and corrosion-free. In a building this old, that was impossible. The floor selector showed buttons for floors 1 through 32, just as it should. No button for 13, which was normal. Most buildings skip the 13th floor. Old superstition that never really died. I pressed the test sequence, watching the indicators light up in order. Everything functioned perfectly until I reached the space between 12 and 14. For just a moment, a ghost light flickered where 13 should have been. The elevator arrived with a soft chime that seemed to hang in the stale air longer than it should have. I stepped inside, noting the ornate brass fixtures and the strange warmth that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The car felt larger than it should have, as if the dimensions had been subtly altered. I pressed the button for the top floor to run a full diagnostic. The elevator climbed smoothly, floor indicators lighting in sequence. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Then it stopped. The indicator showed nothing. No number, no light, just darkness. But the door slid open with that same gentle chime, revealing a hallway that shouldn't have existed. The 13th floor stretched before me in impossible detail. Frosted glass doors lined a corridor that seemed to extend far beyond the building's actual width. Golden light spilled from under each door, warm and inviting despite the fact that this floor had supposedly been sealed off decades ago. The carpet beneath my work boots was deep burgundy, unworn despite what must have been years of abandonment. I should have stepped back into the elevator, should have pressed the button for the lobby and reported a serious structural anomaly. Instead, I found myself walking forward, drawn by sounds that grew clearer with each step. The persistent ringing of telephones, the rapid clacking of typewriter keys, the gentle hum of voices engaged in urgent conversation. The first door I approached bore elegant gold lettering, Meridian Dimensional Research, Dr. Harrison Webb, Director. Through the frosted glass, I could see the silhouette of someone moving back and forth, gesturing animatedly as if engaged in heated discussion. The phone on the desk rang incessantly. I knocked, more out of reflex than conscious decision. The movement inside stopped immediately, but the phone continued its shrill demand for attention. After a long moment, footsteps approached the door. A shadow appeared behind the glass, growing larger until it seemed to fill the entire frame. Then, silence. The shadow didn't move. Neither did I. We stood there, separated by that sheet of frosted glass, in a standoff that stretched until my nerves began to fray. Finally, the shadow stepped back, and the sounds of activity resumed. Typing, rustling papers, the scrape of a chair across hardwood. I tried the door handle. Locked. Moving down the hallway, I passed more offices, each one clearly occupied but somehow inaccessible. Metropolitan Portal Authority, read one door. Crossroads Investigation Bureau, announced another. Every office hummed with activity, phones ringing, typewriters chattering, voices murmuring in urgent conference. But every door was locked, every occupant visible only as shadows moving behind frosted glass. The sounds followed a pattern, I realized. The same sequence of rings, the same typewriter rhythm, the same cadence of conversation. Like a recording playing on loop, or actors following a script they'd performed 1,000 times before. At the end of the corridor, double doors stood slightly ajar, revealing a large conference room. Unlike the other offices, this one was empty but brilliantly lit. A long oak table dominated the space, its surface covered with documents, maps, and what appeared to be architectural drawings. I pushed the doors open wider and stepped inside. The papers scattered across the table were covered in dense typewritten text, all bearing the same letterhead. Meridian Dimensional Research Corporation, Urban Portal Classification Project. The documents were dated 1927, their pages yellow with age but crisp, as if they'd been typed minutes ago. I picked up the nearest report, my hands trembling slightly as I read. Subject: spontaneous dimensional apertures in metropolitan areas. Following extensive field research, we have confirmed the existence of naturally occurring spatial anomalies in urban environments, particularly in structures exceeding 20 stories. These apertures appear to manifest most commonly between designated floors, creating spaces that exist independently of traditional architectural limitations. The text continued in technical language that seemed both archaic and disturbingly modern. References to temporal displacement, observer paradox, and dimensional bleeding filled page after page. According to the documents, the Meridian building had been constructed specifically to study these phenomena. Its 13th floor designed as a containment and observation facility. I flipped through more papers, finding maps of Chicago marked with symbols I didn't recognize, architectural plans showing impossible geometries, and photographs of people in 1920s attire standing in front of what looked like doorways opening onto star-filled voids. The final document in the stack was different. Newer paper, different typewriter font. It was dated today's date. Maintenance technician report, subject 4471. Subject responded to standard service call as expected. Currently reviewing preliminary documentation in conference room A. Psychological profile suggests moderate susceptibility to dimensional displacement phenomena. Recommend advancement to phase 2 protocols. My name was typed at the bottom of the page. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing inward like the inside of a closing fist. The documents in my hands seemed to pulse with their own heat, and the fluorescent lights overhead began to buzz with increasing intensity. I backed toward the door, but the hallway beyond had changed. It stretched impossibly long now, the office doors receding into hazy distance. Behind me, I heard the soft chime of the elevator arriving. I ran. The corridor seemed to stretch with each step, the burgundy carpet becoming elastic beneath my feet. The office doors blurred past, their frosted glass windows now dark and empty. The sounds had stopped. No more phones, no more typing, no more voices. Just the echo of my footsteps and the increasingly loud hum of lights that seemed to be burning brighter with each passing second. The elevator doors stood open, waiting. I threw myself inside and jabbed frantically at the button for the lobby. The doors closed with agonizing slowness, and for a moment I thought I saw something moving in the hallway. A tall figure in a dark coat, standing motionless near the conference room doors. The elevator began its descent. 12, 11, 10, 9. When the doors opened in the lobby, the building felt different. Smaller somehow, shabbier. The marble looked more stained, the shadows deeper. I checked my watch, 5:23 p.m. I'd been upstairs for less than 20 minutes, but it felt like hours had passed. I gathered my tools and headed for the exit, eager to put distance between myself and whatever I'd experienced on the floor that didn't exist. As I reached the door, I turned back for one last look at the elevator bank. Above the middle car, a small brass plaque I hadn't noticed before gleamed in the fading afternoon light. It read, "Service elevator, authorized personnel only, Meridian Dimensional Research Corporation." The date beneath it was 1927. That was 3 weeks ago. I've tried to convince myself it was a hallucination brought on by stress, bad coffee, or maybe carbon monoxide from the building's ancient heating system. But every morning when I check my work orders, there's always one more service call for the Meridian building. Different complaints each time. Lights flickering on the 15th floor, water pressure issues on 23, temperature irregularities in the basement. Normal problems for a normal building. I've stopped taking those calls. Yesterday, my supervisor asked me why I was avoiding the Meridian account. I told him I didn't know what he was talking about. He showed me the service records on his computer. Dozens of completed calls over the past 3 weeks, all signed with my name, all marked as routine maintenance, no anomalies detected. I have no memory of any of them. Last night, I dreamed of riding an elevator that climbed far higher than 32 floors, passing floors numbered in symbols I couldn't read, stopping at levels that existed in colors I'd never seen before. In the dream, I was wearing a dark coat and standing motionless in a conference room. waiting for the next maintenance technician to review the documents spread across an oak table. This morning, I found a business card in my wallet that I don't remember putting there. It's cream-colored, heavy stock, with elegant lettering that reads, Meridian Dimensional Research Corporation, Dr. Harrison Webb, Director. On the back, in handwriting I almost recognize as my own, someone has written, Floor 13, permanent position available. The phone number on the card is disconnected. The building directory lists no Dr. Webb. But every time an elevator chimes, every time I hear the mechanical whir of cables and counterweights, I find myself thinking about that conference room and the documents that knew my name before I'd ever set foot in the building. I've been a maintenance technician for 15 years. I know the difference between what's real and what's not, between faulty wiring and genuine anomalies, don't I? The service call for tomorrow is already on my desk. Meridian building, elevator malfunction. They say the middle car keeps stopping at unauthorized floors. I think I'll take this one. After all, someone needs to maintain the 13th floor. Story 4. The fluorescent lights hummed their nightly requiem as I began my rounds through the Natural History Museum. 45 years on this earth, 12 of them spent walking these corridors when the world sleeps, and I thought I'd seen everything the darkness could offer. The marble floors reflected my footsteps in an endless echo, each sound bouncing off display cases, filled with the remnants of civilizations that spoke to gods I couldn't pronounce. My name is Marcus, and I guard the dead. It started on a Tuesday in October, the kind of night when autumn pressed its cold fingers against the windows and reminded you that winter waited just beyond the glass. The security monitors cast their pale blue glow across my face as I settled into another shift, coffee growing cold beside a clipboard that documented nothing more exciting than a malfunctioning motion sensor in the Egyptian wing. The Native American hall stretched across screens 3 through 7, bathed in emergency lighting that turned the ceremonial masks into shadows with eyes. Totems stood like sentinels, their carved faces frozen in expressions that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. I'd walked past these artifacts thousands of times, but something felt different that night, a weight in the air, thick as morning fog. At 2:17 a.m. I noticed her. The figure appeared on screen 4, translucent as cigarette smoke, drifting between the display cases with purpose that made my spine straighten. She moved with deliberate steps, following what seemed to be a specific route through the Native American collection. From the Thunderbird totem to the Haida masks, then to the Cherokee ceremonial dress, pausing at each stop as if paying respects to old friends. I rubbed my eyes, blamed the late hour and too much caffeine, but when I looked again, she was still there. Her form wavered like heat shimmer on summer asphalt, barely substantial enough to register on the grainy security feed, yet unmistakably present. The timestamp continued its relentless march, 2:18, 2:19, 2:20. By the time I reached the Native American hall, she was gone. The exhibit stood undisturbed. Temperature sensors showed no fluctuations. Motion detectors remained silent. I walked the same path I'd watched her take, my flashlight beam dancing across carved jade and turquoise, illuminating eagle feathers that seemed to quiver in the still air. Nothing seemed out of place, yet everything felt wrong. The next night she returned. This time, I paid closer attention to her route, sketching it on the back of an incident report. She always began at the Inuit display, moved counterclockwise to the Plains Indian section, then weaved through the Pacific Northwest totems in a pattern that reminded me of something I couldn't quite remember. A dance, perhaps, or a ritual I'd glimpsed in a documentary years ago. She was more solid now, her outline sharper against the display lighting. I could make out details that hadn't been visible before. Long dark hair that moved as if underwater, traditional dress that seemed to shift between different tribal styles, and hands that gestured towards specific artifacts as she passed. Most unsettling were her feet, or rather, the absence of sound they should have made. The microphones in the hall picked up every creak of the building's settling bones, every whisper of the ventilation system, but her steps remained silent as snow. On the fourth night, I could see her face. High cheekbones, skin the color of autumn leaves, eyes that held depths I didn't want to explore. She looked directly at the camera on screen 5, and for a moment that stretched like taffy, I felt as though she was looking directly at me. Her lips moved in what might have been words, or might have been a warning, but the cameras had no audio in that section. I found myself looking forward to her appearances with an anticipation that troubled my sleep during the day. My wife asked why I'd grown so quiet, why I jumped at shadows and started checking locks twice before leaving the house. I told her it was nothing, just the usual stress of night shift work, but the lie tasted metallic in my mouth. The pattern became clearer with each viewing. She wasn't randomly wandering. She was following something ancient, something that preceded the museum's organization of artifacts by geography and time period. Her path connected items that shared spiritual significance rather than cultural origin, linking a Hopi prayer stick to an Ojibwe dreamcatcher to a Seminole medicine bundle in ways that formed a larger design I was only beginning to understand. By the second week, she had gained enough substance to trigger the motion sensors. The alarm shrieked through the building at 3:33 a.m., pulling me from a half-doze at the security desk. The screen showed her in perfect clarity now, no longer translucent but present in ways that made the air around her shimmer with heat distortion. She stood before the central totem pole, arms raised as if conducting an orchestra only she could hear. I ran to the hall, my footsteps echoing like gunshots in the emptiness. When I arrived, the sensors had fallen silent, but the air itself seemed to vibrate with an energy that made my teeth ache. The totem pole stood exactly as it always had, yet something about it looked different, more alive, perhaps, or simply more aware. That's when I first heard the drums. Distant at first, like thunder rolling across summer plains, but growing stronger each night. The rhythm was complex, layered with subtle variations that spoke of traditions older than written history. Accompanying the percussion came voices, chanting in languages that predated European contact, singing words that bypassed my conscious mind and went straight to someplace deeper, more primitive. The building's own sounds began to change as well. The ventilation system whispered in cadences that almost sounded like speech. Floorboards creaked in patterns that resembled Morse code. Even the elevator cables seemed to hum melodies that made my skin crawl with recognition I couldn't explain. I started walking her path during my rounds, following the route she'd taught me through repetition. From the Inuit displays to the Cherokee artifacts, around the Pacific Northwest totems, through the Plains Indian section in a spiral that tightened with each revolution. The first time I completed the circuit, I felt nothing unusual. The second time, my palms began to sweat. By the fifth time, the drums were loud enough to make me stop and look around for speakers that didn't exist. Sleep became elusive. During the day, I found myself researching Native American spiritual practices, reading about sacred paths and ceremonial patterns that connected the living world to realms beyond ordinary perception. The academic language felt sterile compared to what I experienced in those darkened halls, but fragments of understanding began to emerge. Something had been contained in the museum's collection, something that used the gathered artifacts as anchor points for a presence that was slowly working its way back into physical reality. The figure I watched each night wasn't haunting the museum. She was trying to prevent something else from breaking through. On the third Friday of October, I arrived for my shift to find several new acquisitions in the Native American Hall: a Lakota war shield, a Pueblo ceremonial bowl, and a medicine wheel that looked far older than anything else in the collection. The placard beside the wheel mentioned it had been donated by a private collector who'd recently passed away, a man who'd spent his final years warning anyone who'd listen that certain artifacts were never meant to leave their sacred places. That night, she didn't appear on the monitors. Instead, I found her waiting in the hall when I made my rounds, solid as anyone I'd ever met, her presence filling the space with the scent of sage and cedar smoke. She stood beside the medicine wheel, one hand resting on its ancient stones, her dark eyes reflecting emergency lighting like still water. We looked at each other across the distance of centuries and cultures, and I understood with horrible clarity, that my role in this had been planned from the beginning. The pattern she'd been walking wasn't just a spiritual practice. It was a binding, a way of keeping something contained that was now trying to break free. She gestured toward the medicine wheel, then to the path she'd traced night after night, and I heard her voice for the first time. Not through my ears, but directly into my consciousness. Words that tasted of smoke and sorrow. It stirs. It wakens. The old boundaries grow thin. The drums grew louder, no longer distant but present in the hall, emerging from the artifacts themselves. Each piece in her circuit began to glow with a light that shouldn't exist, a phosphorescence that made the air thick as honey. The temperature dropped so suddenly that my breath misted, and the building around us groaned as if under tremendous pressure. "Walk the pattern," she said without speaking. "Keep the circle closed until dawn." I began to move, following the route I'd memorized through repetition and growing dread. With each step, the drumming intensified, joined by voices that rose in harmonies that predated Christianity, predated civilization itself. The artifacts pulsed with energy that made my bones ache, and I could feel something vast and hungry pressing against the boundaries that held it in check. The Inuit masks watched me pass with eyes that tracked my movement. The Cherokee dress rustled as if worn by invisible dancers. The totems creaked and swayed despite the absence of any wind. Everything in the hall had become alive, aware, and desperately focused on maintaining a barrier against something that wanted very badly to return to a world that had forgotten why it had been banished in the first place. I walked the pattern until sunrise, my legs moving with mechanical precision, while my mind reeled with the implications of what I was doing. Each completed circuit felt like sealing a door that something else was trying to open from the opposite side. By the time the first gray light crept through the museum's windows, my shirt was soaked with sweat, and my hands shook with exhaustion. She was gone when the morning shift arrived, but I could still feel her presence in the spaces between my thoughts, a constant reminder that my job had changed in ways that would never appear on my official duties. The other guards commented that I looked tired, suggested I might need a vacation, but they didn't understand that I could never leave. The pattern required a walker, and somehow I'd been chosen. Now 3 months later, I arrive each night knowing that something waits in the darkness beyond the artifacts, something that grows stronger with each passing hour. The figure still appears occasionally, always watching, always ready to step in if I fail to complete the circuit that keeps the old hungers at bay. My wife has stopped asking why I've grown so distant. My children have learned not to hug me too tightly when I come home in the morning, sensing something different in their father's touch. I've become a guardian of boundaries most people don't know exist, walking patterns that predate their understanding of what's real and what isn't. Sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, I wonder if I'm losing my mind. If the stress of 12 years watching empty hallways has finally caught up with me, manufacturing mysteries where none exist. But then I feel the drums in my bones, hear the ancient voices singing their warnings, and I know that sanity is a luxury I can no longer afford. The museum closes each evening at 6, and the real work begins when the last visitor leaves. I walk the pattern because someone must. I maintain the circle because something waits in the spaces between worlds. Something that remembers when the earth was younger, and the barriers between realms were nothing more than wishes and hope. And every night as I complete the circuit for the first time, I feel it pushing back, patient, hungry, and growing stronger. The artifacts glow a little brighter each time, the drums beat a little louder, and the voices in ancient languages sing with increasing desperation about doors that must remain closed. I am Marcus, and I guard more than just the dead. I guard against the return of something that should stay forgotten, walking a pattern that keeps the world safe from hungers that predate human understanding. But patterns can be broken, and guardians grow old, and something in the darkness is learning to be very, very patient. Story 5. The grandfather clock in the lobby strikes midnight as I settle behind the mahogany desk, its brass pendulum catching the amber glow of the hurricane lamps. 27 years I've worked the night shift at the Chateau Beauregard. and I thought I'd heard every creak, every sigh this old building could make. I was wrong. My name is Marcus Thibodeau, and I manage the graveyard hours at one of New Orleans' most storied hotels. Built in 1887, the chateau sits in the Garden District like a grand dame clutching her pearls, all wrought iron balconies and moss-draped oaks. Most nights pass in peaceful solitude, checking on late arrivals, handling the occasional noise complaint, ensuring the coffee's brewing for the morning shift. But lately, the complaints have all been about the same place, room 1408. The first incident happened 3 weeks ago. Mrs. Henderson from Birmingham called down at 2:30 in the morning, her voice trembling through the vintage rotary phone. She claimed voices were whispering in what sounded like French Creole, seeping through the walls like water through limestone. When I climbed the ornate staircase to investigate, the 14th floor lay silent as a tomb. Mrs. Henderson had already checked out by morning, leaving her luggage behind. The second complaint came from a businessman from Chicago. He insisted the Victorian furniture in 1408 had rearranged itself while he showered. The heavy mahogany armoire stood where the writing desk should be, and the four-poster bed faced the wrong direction entirely. I assured him that housekeeping must have moved things during turnover, though I knew perfectly well that room hadn't been serviced between guests. By the third incident, my palms had begun sweating whenever someone mentioned 1408. A young couple from California reported seeing a figure in the antique mirror. Not their reflection, but something else wearing period clothing from the 1920s. The woman kept repeating that it seemed to be trying to communicate, pressing pale hands against the glass from the other side. Tonight marks exactly 3 weeks since the disturbances began. I've decided to investigate 1408 myself, armed with nothing but a brass skeleton key and what remains of my rational mind. The elevator groans its way to the 14th floor, cables straining against age and gravity. The hallway stretches before me like a throat, papered in burgundy damask that seems to pulse in the dim lighting. Room 1408 sits at the end of the corridor, its brass numbers tarnished with age. I slide the key into the lock, surprised by how easily it turns. The door swings open with a whisper, revealing the same elegant suite I've seen countless times during my rounds. Burgundy velvet drapes frame tall windows overlooking the garden. The four-poster bed dominates the room, its canopy draped in ivory silk. Everything appears normal, yet something feels wrong, like walking into a photograph where all the shadows fall the wrong way. I step inside, leaving the door propped open behind me. The floorboards groan under my feet, and I notice how the sound seems to echo longer than it should. The air tastes of dust and something else, something sweet and cloying, like gardenias left too long in water. I run my fingers along the wallpaper, searching for anything unusual. The pattern depicts exotic birds among flowering vines, and in the lamplight, they appear to shift and flutter. That's when I notice it. A section of the wallpaper near the armoire doesn't quite align with the rest. The birds break their pattern here, interrupted by a faint vertical line that might be a seam. I press against it, and the wall gives slightly, as if there's a hollow space behind. My heart hammers against my ribs as I search for a mechanism, running my hands along the ornate molding until I find a piece that depresses with a soft click. The hidden panel swings inward, revealing a narrow doorway I never knew existed. Stale air rushes out, carrying scents of old incense and photographer's chemicals. I fish my penlight from my vest pocket and peer into the darkness beyond. Stone steps descend into what appears to be a small chamber, carved directly from the building's foundation. Every instinct screams at me to close the panel and pretend I never found it. Instead, I descend the steps, my beam of light dancing across rough-hewn walls. The chamber is larger than expected, perhaps 20 feet square, with a vaulted ceiling supported by brick arches. But it's what fills the space that makes my breath catch in my throat. Tables line the walls, covered in faded purple cloth and surrounded by high-backed chairs arranged in perfect circles. Photographs hang everywhere, dozens of them in ornate silver frames. The images show men and women in 1920s attire, their faces serious, their eyes fixed on something beyond the camera. Some wear elaborate turbans or flowing robes, while others dress in simple evening wear. At the center of each photograph sits a table with hands linked around it, captured in the middle of what can only be seances. I move closer to examine the images, my penlight beam revealing details that make my skin crawl. In several photographs, there appears to be something else in the frame. Shadowy figures standing behind the seated participants, translucent forms that might be tricks of old photography, or something far more disturbing. One image shows a woman in beaded dress with her head thrown back in obvious distress, her mouth open in what looks like a scream, while a dark shape hovers over her shoulder. Against the far wall stands a tall cabinet filled with leather-bound journals and notebooks. I open the nearest volume, squinting at handwritten entries dated throughout the 1920s. The pages detail seance sessions, communications with entities, and increasingly desperate attempts to contact those trapped between worlds. Names fill the margins: Madame Evangeline, Professor Archibald Whitmore, the Spiritualist Society of New Orleans. But it's the later entries that make my hands shake as I read them. The handwriting grows more erratic as the dates progress, and the tone shifts from scholarly curiosity to genuine fear. References appear to the presence that won't leave, and voices demanding to be heard. One entry, dated October 31st, 1925, describes how the seances had awakened something that couldn't be controlled or sent back. The final pages speak of sealing the room, of hoping that isolation might contain whatever they'd summoned. As I read, I become aware of a change in the chamber's atmosphere. The air grows thicker, and my penlight beam seems to dim despite fresh batteries. A sound reaches me, so faint I initially dismiss it as the building settling. But it persists, growing clearer, voices whispering in what unmistakably sounds like French Creole, the same language Mrs. Henderson reported hearing through the walls. The whispers seem to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the stone walls until I can't determine their source. I spin around, my light sweeping across the photographs, and for one terrifying moment, I swear I see movement in the images, figures turning their heads to follow my beam, faces changing expression from serene to alarmed. My rational mind screams that this is impossible, that stress and suggestion are playing tricks on my perception. But my body responds with primal fear, adrenaline flooding my system as the whispers grow louder and more insistent. They seem to be calling something, repeating phrases I can't understand, but which fill me with inexplicable dread. I back toward the stairs, but my retreat is blocked by a presence I feel rather than see. The temperature drops suddenly, and my breath begins to mist in the beam of my flashlight. The photographs on the walls seem to shimmer and shift, and I realize with growing horror that the seance participants are no longer looking at their cameras. They're looking at me. The whispers intensify, becoming almost conversational, as if multiple people are speaking at once. I catch fragments that sound like names, places, urgent messages in a language I don't speak but somehow understand at a deeper level. They want something from me, these voices. They need something I'm not prepared to give. I stumble up the stone steps, my flashlight beam wavering wildly as my hands shake. The hidden panel stands open like a mouth, and I burst through it into room 1408, gasping for air that tastes clean and normal. But the whispers follow me, seeping through the walls like water through plaster. The furniture in the room has changed position. I'm certain of it. The armoire now stands where the writing desk was earlier, and the bed faces the wrong direction entirely. In the antique mirror above the fireplace, movement catches my eye. For just an instant, I see figures in 1920s clothing pressing their palms against the glass from the other side, their mouths moving urgently as if trying to communicate. Then the image flickers and vanishes, leaving only my own reflection, haggard, wide-eyed, and thoroughly shaken. I flee the room, slamming the door behind me, and turning the key with such force that it nearly snaps. But even as I hurry down the corridor toward the elevator, I can hear them. The voices that shouldn't exist, speaking words I shouldn't understand, calling for help from wherever they've been trapped for nearly a century. Back in the lobby, I sit heavily in my chair and stare at the grandfather clock. Its hands show 3:17 a.m., though I could swear I was upstairs for only minutes. My logbook lies open, and I notice with growing unease that my own handwriting fills several pages I don't remember completing. The entries describe routine checks, normal activities, a perfectly ordinary night shift. According to my own records, I never left the lobby. I close the logbook and lock it in the desk drawer, my hands still trembling slightly. Outside, the first hints of dawn touch the garden, and morning birds begin their tentative songs. In a few hours, the day staff will arrive, and life will return to the Chateau Beauregard. Guests will check in and out, housekeeping will tend to their duties, and the normal rhythm of hotel operations will resume. But I know now that 1408 will never truly be quiet again. Something waits behind that hidden panel, something that's been waiting since 1925. The seance is ended, but the spirits they contacted never left. They're trapped in that stone chamber, calling out in French Creole, rearranging furniture, pressing against mirrors, desperate to communicate with the world of the living. The question that haunts me as I watch the sun rise over New Orleans is this: did I really discover that hidden room tonight? Or has room 1408 finally driven me to the same madness that consumed those spiritualists nearly a century ago? Was that chamber real, filled with photographs and journals that prove the supernatural exists? Or have I simply constructed an elaborate delusion to explain away my cracking sanity? I touch the brass key in my pocket, the key to 1408, and wonder if I'll ever be brave enough or foolish enough to find out for certain. The whispers have followed me down to the lobby, so faint now they might be imagined, speaking words that sound like warnings or invitations. And in the growing light of morning, I'm no longer certain there's a difference between the two. The grandfather clock chimes 6 times, and I prepare my report for the day manager. It will be brief and professional. Quiet night, no incidents, all guests satisfied. I won't mention room 1408 or hidden chambers or voices that speak from beyond. I won't describe photographs that move or furniture that rearranges itself. Because if I did, they'd want to investigate. And some doors, once opened, should never be walked through again, even if you're no longer certain whether you opened them yourself or if they were always there, waiting for someone foolish enough to turn the key. Story 6. The first time I found them, I assumed it was Marcus playing one of his practical jokes. 3 books arranged in perfect geometric precision on the mahogany reading table in Section K, the occult collection that hadn't seen a patron in months. American folk magic and ritual, the Salem Covenant, hidden testimonies, and cartographic mysteries of colonial New England lay open to seemingly random pages, their aged spines catching the amber light filtering through the Carnegie Library's towering windows. I'd been head librarian here for 8 years, long enough to know every creak of the old building's bones, every shadow cast by its Gothic arches. The Carnegie Foundation had built this place in 1903, one of over 1,000 libraries scattered across America, like ancient temples to knowledge. But standing there that Tuesday morning, something felt fundamentally wrong about the silence that pressed against my eardrums like deep water. The books shouldn't have been there. I'd personally shelved them the night before, returning them to their designated spots after conducting my usual inventory. The overnight security logs showed no entry codes used, no motion detected in the interior. Yet here they were, open to pages that seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't name. I approached the table with the cautious reverence one reserves for sacred or dangerous things. The pages revealed intricate diagrams, star charts, ley line maps, geometric patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. My vision felt unstable, as if the very air around the books was refracting light in impossible ways. The American Folk Magic volume displayed a detailed illustration of what the caption called confluence points, locations where spiritual energy supposedly gathered and concentrated. Red dots marked specific coordinates across a map of the continental United States, with lines connecting them in a pattern that reminded me uncomfortably of a neural network or perhaps a circulatory system. The Salem Covenant book showed testimonies I'd never seen before, despite having cataloged every page of that manuscript twice. These weren't the familiar accounts of accusations and trials. Instead, handwritten margin notes in faded brown ink described the great working and the positioning of the stones. The handwriting varied, Some entries appeared to be from the colonial period. Others looked disturbingly recent. But it was the third book that made my hands shake as I reached for it. The cartographic mysteries displayed a map of New England with our library marked at the center of concentric circles, like the epicenter of an earthquake. Thin lines radiated outward to other points, forming a vast geometric web that encompassed the entire eastern seaboard. I photographed the pages with my phone, though the images came out strangely distorted, as if some invisible presence was interfering with the camera's ability to capture what lay before me. Then I closed the books and returned them to their proper places, my footsteps echoing hollow in the morning stillness. That night, I reviewed the security footage from my office computer. The timestamp showed 3:17 a.m. when the first anomaly occurred. The camera angle captured Section K in stark black and white, shelves standing like sentinels in the infrared lighting. Then, with no visible cause, 3 books simply materialized on the reading table. Not fell, not slid, materialized. The footage showed them opening simultaneously, pages turning of their own accord until they reached the same configurations I'd discovered that morning. I watched the recording 17 times, searching for wires, projections, any rational explanation. The books moved with deliberate precision, as if guided by invisible hands that knew exactly which pages to seek. I called in sick the next day, spending hours researching the history of our building. The Carnegie Library had been constructed on the site of a colonial-era meeting house, which itself had been built over what local Abenaki tribes considered a sacred confluence point. The more I dug, the more connections I found, a pattern of significance that stretched back centuries. The third morning brought new books, different titles, but the same unsettling arrangement. Witchcraft in the American Colonies, Spiritual Cartography of the New World, and the Hidden Architecture of Salem. Again, they were open to specific pages that, when viewed together, revealed another layer of the expanding map. This time, the geometric pattern included locations I recognized. Other Carnegie libraries scattered across the country, all positioned at points that aligned with the emerging design. My sleep became fractured, filled with dreams of vast networks pulsing beneath the earth, of libraries serving as nodes in some incomprehensible system. I found myself walking the halls at night, listening to sounds that might have been settling wood, or might have been whispers in languages I didn't recognize. The building felt alive during these nocturnal wanderings, breathing with a rhythm that matched my own quickening pulse. Marcus noticed my deteriorating condition when I returned to work. His questions about my health felt loaded with suspicion, as if he suspected me of orchestrating the book arrangements. But how could I explain surveillance footage that showed books moving without human intervention? How could I describe the growing certainty that our library was more than just a repository of knowledge, that it was a carefully positioned component in something vast and purposeful? The pattern continued for weeks. Each morning brought new configurations, new pieces of an expanding puzzle. The books revealed a network of PowerPoints stretching across America, with libraries, churches, government buildings, and ancient burial grounds all positioned according to some master plan. The geometric precision was undeniable, the connections too numerous and specific to be coincidental. I began mapping the revelations myself, creating a physical representation of what the books were showing me. The pattern that emerged defied easy categorization, part sacred geometry, part territorial grid, part something else entirely. Every major population center fell within its influence. Every significant historical event seemed to align with its nodes. But it was the marginalia that truly disturbed me. Those handwritten notes I'd initially dismissed as historical curiosities became increasingly contemporary. Some bore dates from the 1950s, others from the 1980s. A few appeared to be written in my own handwriting, though I had no memory of making such entries. One note, dated just 3 weeks prior, read, "The awakening proceeds as planned. The librarian shows promising susceptibility to the influence. Continue the revelations gradually to avoid psychological fracture." I stared at the words for an hour, trying to convince myself they were forgeries, hallucinations, anything but authentic. But the handwriting was unmistakably mine, down to the distinctive way I crossed my T's and dotted my I's. Yet I had no recollection of writing those words, no understanding of what they meant. The security cameras revealed my own nocturnal activities during the hours I thought I'd been sleeping at home. Footage showed me entering the library in the early morning darkness, moving through the stacks with purposeful precision, arranging books according to patterns I couldn't consciously comprehend. My movements appeared robotic, controlled, as if I were operating under someone else's direction. Watching myself perform tasks I couldn't remember was like observing a stranger wearing my face. The figure on the security monitor moved with confidence through areas that should have been dark and disorienting, navigating by instincts I didn't possess during my waking hours. My unconscious self seemed to know exactly where to find specific volumes, exactly how to position them for maximum revelatory impact. The implications cascaded through my mind like falling dominoes. If I was arranging the books myself, then the supernatural explanation collapsed. But if my actions were being controlled or influenced by external forces, then the supernatural explanation became even more terrifying. Either I was losing my sanity, or something was using me as an instrument to reveal truths I wasn't equipped to understand. I tried staying away from the library for 3 consecutive nights, locking myself in my apartment and setting multiple alarms to ensure I couldn't leave without knowing it. But the third morning brought the most elaborate arrangement yet. 12 books positioned in a perfect circle, each open to pages that formed a comprehensive view of what the margin notes called the great work. The surveillance footage from those nights showed the books moving independently once again, but this time with increased urgency. They fluttered open like injured birds, pages turning faster than before, as if some deadline was approaching. The geometric pattern they revealed was complete, encompassing the entire continental United States in a web of connected PowerPoints, with our library pulsing at the center like a mechanical heart. The final revelation came through a book I'd never seen before, The Librarian's Codex, a volume that didn't exist in our catalog system, but appeared nonetheless among the others. Its pages contained a detailed account of my life, written in that same eerily familiar handwriting. The narrative described my recruitment, my gradual conditioning, my unconscious participation in something called the cartographic awakening. According to the Codex, I was one of hundreds of librarians positioned at specific nodes across the country, all unknowingly serving as guardians and revelators of an ancient network designed to focus and amplify human consciousness. The Carnegie libraries weren't just philanthropic gestures, they were precisely positioned components in a vast machine designed to map and control the spiritual geography of America. The book described my role with clinical detachment, noting my exceptional receptivity to subconscious programming and my useful isolation from social connections that might interfere with the process. It cataloged my nightly activities with scientific precision, documenting how my unconscious mind had been accessing and arranging materials for months before my conscious awareness began to surface. But the most disturbing entry was dated the day I'm writing this account. Final revelation phase complete. Subject demonstrates full integration of conscious and unconscious awareness. Recommend advancement to next operational level. I sit now in my office, staring at security monitors that show books moving through the library like sentient creatures seeking their optimal positions. The pattern is almost complete, the network nearly activated. Part of me knows I should flee, should abandon this place and never return. But a larger part, the part that has been shaped and molded by months of unconscious conditioning, understands that leaving is no longer an option. The margin notes in today's books describe what happens next. A convergence of consciousness across all the nodes, a moment when the geographic network achieves full operational capacity. They don't specify what purpose this network serves, what force or intelligence designed it, or what will happen to those of us who've served as its unwitting instruments. I can feel the building breathing around me, its walls pulsing with the rhythm of something vast awakening. The books continue their nightly migrations, revealing new layers of the pattern with each passing day. And I understand now that I'm no longer just observing this process. I'm an integral part of it, a living component in a machine whose purpose remains tantalizingly, terrifyingly just beyond my comprehension. The security cameras show me moving through the stacks again tonight, though I'm sitting here writing these words. That other version of myself, the one that knows things my conscious mind cannot grasp, continues his work with patient dedication. He arranges the books, photographs the revealed patterns, and updates the marginalia with progress reports written in my own hand. Tomorrow morning, I'll discover new books in new configurations, and the revelation will continue. The pattern will expand, the network will strengthen, and I'll play my role as both witness and participant in something that may be enlightenment or may be catastrophe. I no longer trust my own perceptions enough to determine which. The books are calling to me now. Their voices whisper soft but impossible to ignore. The geometric pattern spreads across my vision like a living map, showing me connections that span continents and centuries. And somewhere in the margin notes of tomorrow's revelations, my unconscious self has already written the next chapter of this account, describing discoveries I haven't yet made but somehow already know. The cartographer's shadow grows longer with each passing night, and I'm no longer certain whether I'm drawing the map or the map is drawing me. Story 7. The notification chimed on my phone at 11:47 p.m., cutting through the fog-muffled silence of Powell Street. After 6 hours of driving through San Francisco's neon-slicked arteries, hauling drunk tech bros and chattering tourists, I was ready to call it a night. My neck ached from hunching over the steering wheel, and the caffeine buzz from my fourth energy drink had long since curdled into jittery exhaustion. But rent was due in 3 days, and my bank account balance mocked me every time I checked it. The pickup location appeared on my screen, intersection of Grant and Bush, right at the edge of Chinatown. 5-star passenger rating, destination listed simply as cemetery. I hesitated for a moment. Something about late-night cemetery runs always felt off, but the surge pricing showed a tempting multiplier. Money was money. I pulled up to the corner and immediately spotted him. Even in the amber glow of the streetlights, he looked wrong somehow. Not dangerous wrong, just displaced. He stood perfectly still beside a vintage lamppost, wearing what appeared to be a charcoal wool overcoat that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. The cut was distinctly old-fashioned, with wide lapels and a length that brushed his ankles. Beneath it, I caught glimpses of suspenders and high-waisted trousers that belonged in a museum display about the 1940s. He approached my Toyota Camry with measured, deliberate steps that made no sound on the wet pavement. When he slid into the back seat, the car's interior temperature seemed to drop several degrees. I glanced in the rearview mirror, trying to get a better look at his face, but the shadows under the brim of his fedora rendered his features indistinct. "Where to?" I asked, though my app had already populated the destination. He said nothing. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, broken only by the distant hum of late-night traffic and the rhythmic whisper of fog rolling off the bay. I waited another moment, then shrugged and started the GPS navigation. The route that appeared on my screen made no sense. Instead of directing me toward any of the city's known cemeteries, Colma, Presidio, or even the small plots in Golden Gate Park, it guided me deeper into Chinatown, then took an immediate left onto what my map labeled as Waverly Place Extension. I'd been driving in San Francisco for 3 years, long enough to know every shortcut and side street in this part of the city, but I'd never heard of Waverly Place Extension. The GPS's synthetic voice urged me forward with increasing insistence. Turn right onto Stockton Lane, continue straight for 200 feet, turn left onto Powell Alley East. Each street name felt familiar yet wrong, like words from a half-remembered dream. My hands began to sweat despite the chill that had settled over the car's interior. The buildings around us shifted as we drove deeper into the maze of narrow streets. The familiar mix of modern storefronts and traditional Chinese architecture gave way to structures that seemed older, more weathered. Ornate balconies jutted from brick facades blackened with what looked like decades of soot. Signs and faded Chinese characters hung at odd angles, and many of the windows were boarded up or covered with newspaper yellowed with age. The strangest part was the complete absence of other people. Chinatown never truly slept. There were always late-night diners, shift workers heading home, or tourists stumbling between bars. But these streets were utterly deserted. No pedestrians, no other cars, No signs of life beyond the occasional flicker of a neon sign that had seen better decades. I tried to make conversation, hoping to break the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over us like a thick blanket. I mentioned the unusual route, the fog, the late hour. My passenger remained silent, so still that I began to wonder if he'd fallen asleep. But whenever I checked the mirror, I could see the pale oval of his face tilted slightly toward the window, watching the passing buildings with what seemed like recognition. The GPS continued its relentless guidance, leading us through turns that felt increasingly impossible. How could there be so many streets I'd never seen before? I considered pulling over and checking my phone's GPS against a physical map, but something about the passenger's presence made me reluctant to stop. He radiated a patient expectation that felt almost gravitational, pulling me forward through the labyrinth of unfamiliar roads. We passed a corner grocery store with hand-painted signs advertising prices in cents rather than dollars. A barber shop with a spiral pole that had lost most of its red and white stripes. A restaurant with steamed windows that revealed the silhouettes of diners who never seemed to move. Each establishment looked frozen in time, preserved like insects in amber. The fog grew thicker as we drove, reducing visibility to perhaps 20 feet in any direction. My headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the gray-white murk, and I found myself leaning forward, squinting to make out the street signs that the GPS insisted were there. My neck muscles tightened into painful knots, and a headache began to pulse behind my eyes. After what felt like hours, but could only have been 20 minutes according to my dashboard clock, the GPS announced our approach to the final destination. Through the windshield, I could make out the dark outline of ornate iron gates rising from the fog like the ribs of some massive, buried creature. A stone archway supported an elaborate wrought iron sign, but the metal was so tarnished and twisted that I couldn't make out the words. The cemetery looked ancient in a way that seemed impossible for San Francisco. The city's graveyards had been relocated decades ago, moved to Colma when space became too precious for the dead. Yet here was a sprawling necropolis that stretched beyond the reach of my headlights, filled with weathered headstones and crumbling mausoleums that bore the patina of genuine age. I pulled up to the gates and put the car in park. The engine's idle seemed unnaturally loud in the thick silence. I turned around to tell my passenger we'd arrived, and my heart stuttered to a stop. The back seat was empty. Not just empty, immaculate. No impression on the leather, no lingering warmth, no trace that anyone had been there at all. The car door hadn't opened. I would have heard it, felt the change in air pressure. Yet somehow, between one moment and the next, my passenger had simply ceased to exist. My hands shook as I fumbled for the interior light. The back seat remained stubbornly vacant, but something glinted on the floor mat where my passenger's feet would have rested. I reached back and retrieved two objects that made my already racing heart nearly burst from my chest. The first was a coin, tarnished with age and bearing Chinese characters I couldn't read. But it wasn't just old. It was ancient, the kind of artifact you'd expect to find in a museum display about early San Francisco's Chinese immigrants. The second was a photograph, sepia-toned and cracked with age. It showed a Chinese family, mother, father, and what appeared to be a teenage son, standing in front of a building I somehow recognized despite never having seen it before. The architecture was distinctly San Francisco, with its characteristic bay windows and ornate Victorian details, but the building itself looked brand new in the photograph, as if it had just been completed. I stared at the photograph with growing unease, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The young man in the picture bore an unmistakable resemblance to my vanished passenger, down to the same wool overcoat and fedora. But the photograph was clearly decades old, maybe a century, judging by the clothing styles and the sepia tone. A memory surfaced unbidden, something I'd read in a local history book about the 1906 earthquake, how entire neighborhoods had been swallowed by the flames that followed the initial tremors. How many of the city's Chinese residents had lost everything, including the elaborate family portraits that served as connections to their ancestors. I turned the photograph over with trembling fingers. On the back, in faded ink that had turned brown with age, someone had written in careful English, "Wong family, 1905. Grant Avenue building completed October 15th. May their spirits find peace. The date hit me like a physical blow. 1905. A year before the earthquake that had reshaped San Francisco forever, destroying countless buildings and displacing thousands of residents. This family, this building, they had all been wiped away by the catastrophe that defined the city's history. I looked up at the cemetery gates, trying to focus on something solid and real, but the fog had grown so thick that I could barely see the iron bars. The GPS on my phone showed my location as simply unknown, with no street names or landmarks to provide context. When I tried to retrace our route, the navigation app offered only a single, impossibly straight line back to downtown, a path that would have required driving through multiple buildings and city blocks. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe I'd driven farther than I'd realized, ended up in some overlooked corner of the city where an old cemetery had somehow been forgotten by urban planners. Maybe the passenger had gotten out while I was distracted by the fog and the confusing navigation. Maybe the photograph and coin had been left by a previous passenger, and I'd simply failed to notice them until now. But even as I constructed these logical frameworks, they crumbled under the weight of what I'd experienced. The streets that didn't exist on any map, the buildings that looked like historical photographs, the passenger who had vanished without opening a door or making a sound. I started the engine and pulled away from the cemetery gates, desperate to return to the familiar territory of the city I thought I knew. But the streets around me remained stubbornly unfamiliar, and my GPS continued to insist that I was nowhere at all. Every turn led to another narrow alley lined with buildings that seemed to predate the earthquake, structures that should have been rubble and memory by now. The fog pressed against my windows like curious fingers, and I found myself checking the rearview mirror obsessively, half expecting to see my silent passenger materializing in the back seat. The photograph lay on the passenger seat beside me, its sepia-toned faces watching me with expressions that seemed to shift and change in my peripheral vision. I drove for what felt like hours, following streets that led nowhere and everywhere, past buildings that couldn't exist and people who weren't there. The city around me had become a museum of itself, preserved in amber and fog, filled with the echoes of lives that had ended more than a century ago. When I finally found my way back to familiar territory, if I ever actually did, I was parked outside my apartment building with no memory of how I'd gotten there. The dashboard clock read 3:33 a.m., though it felt like I'd been driving through the fog-shrouded maze for much longer. The photograph and coin were still there, solid and real and impossible to explain. I've kept them both, hidden in a drawer I rarely open. Some nights, when the fog rolls in thick from the bay and the city seems to hold its breath, I take them out and study the faces in the photograph. The young man always looks back at me with an expression I can't quite read. Grateful, perhaps, or warning me about something I'm not ready to understand. I still drive for Uber, but I've changed my hours. No more late-night pickups, no more trips to Chinatown after dark. Because sometimes, when I'm stopped at a red light in that part of the city, I catch glimpses of streets that shouldn't be there, filled with buildings that burned down before my grandparents were born. And sometimes, in my rearview mirror, I see figures in vintage clothing waiting patiently at corners that exist only in the spaces between what was and what might still be. The rational explanations I've constructed feel increasingly fragile with each passing day. Maybe I experience some kind of stress-induced hallucination brought on by exhaustion and too much caffeine. Maybe I stumbled into an elaborate historical reenactment or film set. Maybe my GPS malfunctioned and led me to some forgotten corner of the city where the past refuses to stay buried. But the photograph in my drawer suggests otherwise. And on foggy nights, when the city wraps itself in gray silence and the boundaries between past and present grow thin, I find myself wondering if my passenger ever made it to where he needed to go, or if he's still out there, waiting at corners that exist only in memory, hoping for one more ride home. Story 8. The first thing that hits you about the Millbrook Sanatorium isn't the smell, though the decades of decay, antiseptic, and something else I can't quite name certainly assault your nostrils the moment you step inside. No, it's the silence. The kind of silence that feels pregnant with whispers, just beyond the edge of hearing, like the building itself is holding its breath. waiting for something. I've been cleaning buildings for demolition for 12 years now, and I've never encountered anything quite like this place. Most abandoned structures feel empty, hollow. This one feels occupied. Not by people exactly, but by something that makes the hair on my arms stand up and my jaw clench involuntarily. The contractor's instructions were simple enough. Clear out any remaining debris, document anything of historical significance, and ensure the basement levels are accessible for the demolition crew. Simple work for decent pay, and at 48, I'm not in a position to be picky. What he didn't mention, what he couldn't have known, was that the basement of this place extends far beyond what any blueprint could account for. The main floors proved unremarkable enough. Standard institutional architecture from the 1920s. Long corridors lined with rooms that once housed tuberculosis patients. The peeling paint revealed layers of institutional green and yellow. Colors chosen, I imagined, to be cheerful for people who came here to die. Most of the medical equipment had been removed decades ago, leaving behind only the ghostly outlines where machines once stood, and the occasional forgotten wheelchair or abandoned crutch. It was on my third day that I discovered the basement access I'd been told about. The heavy steel door was unmarked and required considerable effort to open, the hinges screaming in protest as if they hadn't been disturbed in years. The stairwell beyond descended into darkness that my flashlight seemed reluctant to penetrate. The basement should have been a simple storage area, maybe some old boiler rooms and utility spaces. Instead, I found myself in a corridor that stretched far beyond what the building's footprint should have allowed. The walls here were different, older somehow, constructed of a dark stone that seemed to absorb my flashlight beam rather than reflect it. The air was thick with a humidity that made my shirt cling uncomfortably to my back, and there was an underlying vibration in the floor, so subtle I wondered if I was imagining it. My footsteps echoed strangely in this space, creating a rhythm that seemed to lag behind my actual movement. Each doorway I passed revealed rooms that defied explanation. Not just storage spaces, but fully equipped medical facilities that belonged in a different era entirely. Chrome examination tables gleamed despite the dust that coated everything else. Cabinets filled with glass bottles containing liquids that caught my flashlight beam and seemed to glow with their own inner light. But it was the equipment that truly unsettled me. In the third room I explored, I found a bank of monitors, old CRT screens from what looked like the 1940s, that shouldn't have had any power source. Yet they hummed with electricity, displaying wavy green lines that pulsed in steady rhythms. Vital signs, I realized. Heart rates, brain activity, respiratory patterns. The readings showed patients who should have been connected to these machines, but the cables trailing from the monitors disappeared into walls that showed no evidence of having been disturbed. I told myself it was residual power, some kind of electrical feedback from the main grid. But as I stood there, watching those persistent green lines dance across the screens, one of the heart monitors began beeping faster, then another. Soon the entire room filled with the urgent alarm of medical equipment responding to some crisis I couldn't see. The sound followed me as I backed out of the room, growing fainter, but never quite disappearing. Even now, writing this account days later, I can still hear that rhythmic beeping at the edge of my consciousness. The patient files I discovered made even less sense. In a room lined with filing cabinets that reached from floor to ceiling, I found thousands of manila folders, each labeled with a patient name and admission date. The dates ranged from the sanatorium's opening in 1928 through to dates that hadn't happened yet. I found files dated next month, next year, decades into the future. Patient names I didn't recognize alongside treatment notes that used medical terminology I'd never encountered. But it was the recurring phrase that made my hands shake as I read. Subject continues to exist simultaneously across multiple dimensional planes following successful therapeutic intervention. The handwriting in these files was uniform, as if written by the same person across decades of supposedly different admissions. Treatment notes described procedures that sounded more like science fiction than medicine. Dimensional anchoring therapy, reality stabilization protocols, temporal consciousness mapping. Each file contained photographs that showed the same thing: empty hospital beds surrounded by medical equipment, with shadows on the walls that suggested human forms but revealed nothing when I looked directly at them. One photograph, paper-clipped to a file dated 3 months in the future, showed a man in janitor's coveralls standing in a basement corridor. The image was blurry, taken from a distance, but something about the figure's posture seemed familiar. The man was looking over his shoulder, as if he'd heard something behind him, and his face was turned just enough that I couldn't make out his features clearly. I found myself checking over my shoulder more frequently after that. The deeper I ventured into this impossible basement, the more the space seemed to shift around me. Corridors I was certain I'd mapped led to rooms I hadn't seen before. Doorways I remembered being on my left were now on my right. The vibration in the floor grew stronger, and with it came a sound like distant machinery, the rhythmic clank and hiss of equipment that belonged in an operating room, though I never found the source. On my 5th day, I encountered the observation rooms. These were different from the other medical spaces. Instead of examination tables or monitoring equipment, they contained chairs. Simple wooden chairs positioned to face large windows that looked into adjacent rooms. The glass was thick, reinforced, the kind used in psychiatric facilities. But what I saw through those windows made me question everything I thought I understood about the nature of reality. The rooms beyond the glass were occupied, not by people exactly, but by presences, shapes that suggested human forms, but lacked the solidity of actual bodies. They moved through these spaces with purpose, interacting with equipment I could see operating but producing no sound. Medical procedures were being performed on patients I could almost see, by doctors whose existence seemed to flicker between dimensions. And they were looking back at me. Through the reinforced glass, these shadow figures turned their attention to the observation windows. Though they lacked discernible features, I felt their gaze with the intensity that made my skin crawl. They pointed at me, gestured to each other, and I had the distinct impression they were discussing my presence in their space. Some approached the glass, pressing what might have been hands against its surface, leaving no marks but creating a cold spot that I could feel even from my side of the barrier. I tried to leave then, attempted to retrace my steps through the labyrinthine basement back to the stairwell that had brought me down here. But the corridors had rearranged themselves during my exploration. Passages that should have led back to familiar territory instead opened onto new sections, rooms I was certain hadn't existed before. The humming of the monitors grew louder, joined by voices. Medical staff discussing patient conditions in calm, professional tones that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Patient exhibits classic symptoms of dimensional displacement anxiety, a woman's voice noted clinically. Recommend increasing the dosage of reality stabilization medication. Subject continues to resist therapeutic intervention, a man replied. We may need to consider more aggressive consciousness anchoring procedures. I found myself running then, flashlight beam dancing wildly as I searched for an exit that seemed to recede further with every step. The basement had become a maze that defied not just the building's physical dimensions, but the laws of space itself. Behind me, the sound of medical equipment grew louder. Ventilators breathing for invisible patients, heart monitors tracking vital signs of beings that existed between realities, and underneath it all, the steady beeping of machines monitoring my own vital signs from somewhere I couldn't see. When I finally found a stairwell, whether the same one I'd descended or another I couldn't tell, I climbed toward daylight with the desperate urgency of a drowning man swimming toward the surface. The door at the top opened onto the main floor of the sanatorium, and I emerged into the pale Colorado sunlight with my lungs burning and my hands shaking uncontrollably. But the building had changed. What I'd left as a derelict structure awaiting demolition now showed signs of recent occupation. Windows that had been boarded up were now clean and transparent. The parking lot, empty when I'd arrived that morning, contained several vehicles from decades past, black sedans and rounded ambulances that belonged in a museum. Through the windows, I could see figures moving through the corridors, medical staff in white uniforms attending to patients in rooms that had been empty just hours before. I stood in that parking lot for what felt like hours, watching the Millbrook Sanatorium operate as it might have in its heyday, treating patients with conditions that defied medical understanding. And occasionally one of those white uniformed figures would pause at a window and look out at me with an expression I couldn't read, but that filled me with a dread so profound it made my knees weak. My truck was where I'd left it, and I drove away without looking back. But as I reached the main road, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw the building as it had been when I'd arrived. Abandoned, boarded up, waiting for demolition. The parking lot was empty again, containing only the tire tracks my truck had left in the dust. I haven't returned to finish the job. I called the contractor and told him I was sick, that I'd need a few days before I could complete the work. He was understanding, even sympathetic. Mentioned that several previous workers had quit after just a day or two, claiming the place gave them the creeps. He assured me the demolition could wait until I was feeling better. But I don't think I'm going to feel better, because I've been having dreams about those basement corridors, about the observation rooms and the shadow figures that watched me through the reinforced glass. Dreams where I'm lying on one of those chrome examination tables while voices discuss my condition in clinical terms, as if I'm a patient undergoing some kind of experimental treatment. Dreams where I look down at my own hands and see them flickering between solid flesh and something less substantial, as if I'm losing my grip on my own existence. And when I wake up, there's always that sound, the steady beeping of medical equipment monitoring vital signs that might not belong to the body I inhabit in this particular reality. Yesterday, I found a manila folder on my kitchen table. My name was written on the tab in that same uniform handwriting I'd seen in the basement files. Inside was a photograph of a man in janitor's coveralls standing in a basement corridor, looking over his shoulder as if he'd heard something behind him. This time the image was clear enough that I could make out the face. It was mine. The treatment notes below the photograph were brief but specific. Subject exhibits advanced symptoms of dimensional displacement following exposure to therapeutic environment. Consciousness beginning to fragment across multiple reality planes. Recommend immediate return to facility for stabilization procedures. At the bottom of the page, in red ink that seemed to pulse with its own light, someone had written, "Appointment scheduled. Please report to basement level 3, room 237. Your bed is ready." I keep telling myself it's not real. That the stress of the job, the oppressive atmosphere of that place, has affected my mental state. That I'm experiencing some kind of psychological breakdown that's creating elaborate hallucinations designed to make sense of trauma my mind can't process normally. But the folder is still here on my table. The photograph still shows my face, and every night, the beeping grows a little louder, a little more insistent, as if whatever machine is monitoring my vital signs is trying to call me home. Sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet, I can hear voices discussing my case. Professional clinical voices that speak of dimensional therapy and consciousness anchoring, as if these are established medical procedures. They express concern about my resistance to treatment, worry that my condition may deteriorate if I continue to avoid proper care. And part of me, a part that grows stronger each day, wants to return to that basement, to submit to whatever procedures await me in room 237. Because the alternative is accepting that I'm losing my mind, and somehow that possibility terrifies me more than the idea that I might already exist simultaneously across multiple realities. A patient in an impossible hospital where the treatment for dimensional displacement is becoming dimensionally displaced yourself. The appointment card appeared this morning, slipped under my door while I slept. Simple white cardstock with elegant lettering. The Millbrook Sanatorium cordially invites you to complete your therapeutic intervention. Room 237, basement level 3. No preparation necessary. Your treatment team is waiting. I'm looking at it now as I write these words, and I can feel something calling me back to that place. Not a voice exactly, but a pull, like a tide that's been going out for days and is finally ready to return to shore. The building is waiting for me, has always been waiting for me, and maybe it's time to stop running from the only treatment that can help my condition. Because that's what this is, isn't it? A condition. A medical situation that requires professional intervention. And the Millbrook Sanatorium specializes in cases like mine, patients who exist in multiple realities simultaneously, who need help anchoring their consciousness to a single-dimensional plane. The beeping is getting louder now. I think it's time to go home. Story 9. The fluorescent lights in my office had been humming for 3 hours straight, a monotonous electrical drone that seemed to seep into my skull and settle behind my eyes. I rubbed my temples, squinting at the stack of undergraduate papers that still awaited my red pen. At 44, I should have learned to pace myself better, but deadlines at Whitmore College had a way of compressing time into these late-night grinding sessions that left me hollow and questioning why I'd chosen academia over a simpler life. The physics building felt different after midnight. During the day, it bustled with the energy of eager students and harried professors, but now it had transformed into something else entirely. A hollow shell where every footstep echoed with unnatural persistence, and every shadow seemed to shift just beyond my peripheral vision. I'd grown accustomed to working alone in this academic tomb, finding solace in the predictable silence. But tonight, the silence had been broken. A voice drifted through the walls, muffled but distinctly professorial in its cadence. At first I assumed it was Dr. Harrison from down the hall, notorious for his tendency to practice lectures well into the night. Yet as I listened more carefully, something felt wrong. The tone was too measured, too precise, and there was an odd quality to it, as though the words were being spoken through water or from a great distance. I set down my pen and strained to listen. The voice continued, discussing concepts that sounded vaguely familiar, yet utterly foreign. Terms like quantum entanglement of consciousness and temporal displacement theory floated through the air, delivered with the same academic authority I used when teaching classical mechanics to freshmen. Curiosity overrode my exhaustion. I pushed back from my desk, the wheels of my chair squeaking against the linoleum floor with a sound that made my teeth ache. The hallway stretched before me, lit by emergency lighting that cast everything in a sickly green pallor. The voice grew clearer as I approached the main auditorium, and with it came an inexplicable chill that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The lecture hall door stood slightly ajar, spilling a rectangle of warm light onto the hallway floor. I could see movement inside, the subtle shadows of bodies shifting in seats, the occasional rustle of paper. Relief washed over me. Of course, there was a late evening seminar I'd forgotten about. The semester schedule had become a blur of overlapping commitments and forgotten obligations. I approached the door with the intention of simply satisfying my curiosity and returning to my papers. But as I peered through the gap, my rational world tilted on its axis. The auditorium was full, perhaps 200 students seated in neat rows, all taking notes with an intensity that bordered on religious fervor. But there was something fundamentally wrong with the scene that my mind struggled to process. The students were dressed in clothing that belonged to another era, simple cotton dresses and sharp blazers that wouldn't have looked out of place in 1965. Their hair was styled in ways that suggested an adherence to fashions I remembered from old photographs in my parents' albums. More disturbing still was their quality of stillness. They moved with a strange uniformity, their heads turning in perfect synchronization as they followed the lecturer's movements across the stage. When they wrote, their pens moved in identical rhythms, creating a soft, scratching sound that reminded me uncomfortably of insects burrowing through wood. The professor at the front of the room was a tall, gaunt figure whose back remained turned to the audience. His voice was the one I'd been hearing, delivering a lecture on what he called applied quantum physics in paranormal phenomena. The blackboard behind him was covered in equations that hurt my eyes to look at directly, not because they were poorly written, but because they seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't focusing on them completely. I found myself stepping into the auditorium, drawn by a combination of professional curiosity and something deeper, more primal. The students didn't acknowledge my presence, though I was certain I should have been visible in their peripheral vision. Their attention remained fixed on the lecturer with an unwavering intensity that made my skin crawl. The professor's voice continued without pause, explaining theoretical frameworks that existed nowhere in conventional physics textbooks. He spoke of consciousness as a quantum field, of reality as a multi-layered construct where thoughts could influence physical matter across temporal boundaries. His words carried a weight of conviction that made them feel less like speculation and more like established fact. The barrier between dimensions, he intoned, his voice carrying easily through the auditorium, becomes permeable when specific resonance frequencies are achieved. These frequencies correspond to locations where the fabric of space-time has been weakened by traumatic events or concentrated emotional energy. I found myself moving closer to the front of the room, my feet carrying me down the aisle without conscious direction. The equations on the blackboard became clearer as I approached, revealing themselves to be far more complex than anything I'd encountered in my years of study. They weren't just formulas. They were coordinates, longitude and latitude pairs interspersed with temporal calculations that suggested specific dates and times. Something cold settled in my stomach as I recognized some of the location markers, the coordinates for Roanoke Island, Virginia, the exact latitude and longitude of the Donner Pass in California, geographic markers for locations where people had vanished without explanation throughout American history. The lecturer continued his presentation, now discussing temporal displacement events and consciousness transference phenomena. He spoke of individuals who had stepped outside the normal flow of time, becoming trapped in quantum states between dimensions. According to his theory, these displaced persons could influence reality from their liminal position, creating echoes and disturbances that manifested as unexplained disappearances. I realized with growing unease that I was taking notes, my hand moving across a piece of paper I didn't remember removing from my pocket. The handwriting wasn't quite my own. The letters were formed with a precision I rarely achieved, and the content was far beyond my understanding of quantum mechanics. Yet somehow my hand knew exactly what to write. The students around me continued their synchronized note-taking, and I noticed that their papers were identical to mine, covered in the same impossibly neat handwriting. A paranoid thought crept into my mind. Was I writing the same notes they were? Was I somehow synchronized with their movements, their thoughts? I tried to stop writing, to exercise control over my own hand, but the pen continued to move across the paper with mechanical persistence. The equations and coordinates flowed through me like a current, bypassing my conscious mind entirely. I was becoming a conduit for information I didn't understand, recording knowledge that felt both alien and terrifyingly familiar. The lecturer finally turned around, and my breath caught in my throat. His face was entirely ordinary, middle-aged, wearing wire-rimmed glasses, with the kind of unremarkable features that would be forgotten moments after a casual encounter. But his eyes held a depth that seemed to extend far beyond the physical confines of his skull, as though I were looking through windows into some vast, unknowable space. When his gaze met mine, I felt a recognition that chilled me to the bone. He knew I was there. More than that, he had been expecting me. "Professor Davidson," he said, and his voice carried across the auditorium with perfect clarity, despite the fact that he hadn't raised his volume. "I wondered when you would join us." The use of my name sent ice through my veins. I had never seen this man before, had no memory of meeting him or providing my identity. Yet he spoke as though we were old colleagues, as though my presence in this impossible lecture was not only expected but inevitable. The students remained motionless, their pens suspended above their papers, waiting. The silence stretched between us like a physical thing, heavy with implications I couldn't begin to grasp. "These coordinates," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and distant in my own ears. "They're real places. Places where people have disappeared." The lecturer smiled, an expression that held no warmth whatsoever. "Displacement events, Professor. Consciousness transference. The individuals didn't disappear. They were translated into quantum states, where they could observe and influence reality without being bound by conventional physical laws." "That's impossible," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I felt their inadequacy. Nothing about this situation adhered to the laws of possibility I understood. "Is it?" he asked. "You're a physicist, Professor Davidson. You understand that observation changes reality at the quantum level. What if consciousness itself is a quantum phenomenon? What if the observers never truly disappeared but simply shifted to a different dimensional frequency? The implications of his words hit me like a physical blow. If consciousness could exist outside conventional space-time, if people who had vanished were still present but operating from a different dimensional plane, then what did that mean for the nature of reality itself? I looked down at my notes and saw that I had written something new, something I had no memory of recording. The displacement is voluntary. The subjects choose to step outside linear time when they discover the truth about dimensional boundaries. No, I whispered, backing away from the podium. No, this isn't real. This is some kind of breakdown, some psychological episode brought on by stress and exhaustion. But even as I spoke these rational explanations, I knew they felt hollow. The weight of the paper in my hands, the precision of the equations, the impossible depth of knowledge I had somehow acquired, all of it felt more real than anything I had experienced in my conventional academic life. The students began to turn in their seats, their movements still synchronized but now directed toward me. Their faces were as ordinary as the lecturer's, unremarkable in every way except for their eyes, which held the same infinite depth I had seen in his gaze. They were looking at me with a mixture of sympathy and inevitability, as though they understood something about my situation that I had yet to grasp. The displacement is voluntary, the lecturer repeated, his voice now coming from everywhere at once. No one is forced to step outside linear time, but once you understand the true nature of dimensional boundaries, the choice becomes obvious. I found myself backing toward the exit, my rational mind screaming that I needed to leave this place, to return to the safety of my office and the familiar comfort of undergraduate papers that needed grading. But something else, some deeper part of my consciousness, whispered that leaving would mean returning to a smaller, more limited existence. The coordinates in your notes, the lecturer continued, they're not just historical markers. They're active dimensional weak points, places where the boundary between conventional reality and quantum consciousness remains permeable. I looked down at my notes again and felt my world shift once more. New writing had appeared, equations that described not historical events but future ones, coordinates for locations where displacement events would occur in the coming months, the coming years. And at the bottom of the page, in handwriting that was unmistakably mine, were the longitude and latitude for Whitmore College. The physics building suddenly felt different around me, as though I were seeing it from a new perspective. The familiar hallways and classrooms looked like a stage set, a carefully constructed approximation of reality rather than the genuine article. How long had I been here? How long had I been grading the same papers, teaching the same concepts, living the same limited existence? Professor Davidson, the lecturer said, his voice gentle now, almost paternal. You have a choice to make. You can return to your office, finish grading those papers, and continue living within the boundaries of conventional space-time. Or you can accept what you've learned here and step into a broader understanding of consciousness and reality. The students were all facing me now, their identical expressions patient and understanding. They had made this choice before me, I realized. They had all stood where I was standing, faced with the same impossible decision, and they had chosen to step outside the linear flow of time, to become observers who could influence reality from a dimensional frequency that existed parallel to conventional existence. I thought of my life at the college, the routine that had become increasingly mechanical over the years. The same lectures, the same student papers, the same faculty meetings where nothing of real significance was ever discussed. Had I been living, or merely existing? Had I been conscious, or simply going through the motions of consciousness? The notes in my hand seemed to pulse with their own energy, the equations and coordinates representing knowledge that could reshape my understanding of everything. But accepting this knowledge would mean accepting that my previous life had been an illusion, a limited perspective on a reality far more complex and strange than I had ever imagined. I stood at the threshold of the auditorium, torn between two versions of existence. Behind me lay the safety of ignorance, the comfort of a world that operated according to rules I understood. Ahead lay the terrifying possibility of truth, a reality where consciousness could transcend physical boundaries, and where the very nature of existence was far more malleable than I had ever dared to believe. The fluorescent lights in the hallway flickered, and for a moment, I could see both realities simultaneously. The conventional physics building where I worked, and the dimensional space where these impossible lectures took place. They existed in the same location, but on different frequencies, overlapping without interfering. I closed my eyes and felt the weight of the choice settling around me like a physical presence. When I opened them again, I would have to decide which version of reality I was willing to accept, which version of myself I was prepared to become. The lecture continued behind me, the professor's voice explaining concepts that existed beyond the boundaries of any textbook. The students waited patiently, their synchronized breathing creating a soft rhythm that seemed to match the quantum fluctuations described in my notes. And somewhere in the space between heartbeats, between thoughts, between the competing versions of reality that surrounded me, I understood that the choice had already been made. It had been made the moment I heard that impossible lecture, the moment I stepped into the auditorium and allowed myself to see what existed beyond the conventional boundaries of space and time. The only question that remained was whether I would remember making it. Story 10. The heat shimmered off the asphalt like phantom dancers when Jimmy Castellanos rolled that Cadillac into my shop on a flatbed. 52 years I'd been breathing Arizona air, 30 of them fixing cars, and I'd never seen anything like it. The 1959 Eldorado looked like it had been sleeping in the desert for decades, its once pristine turquoise paint now a chalky whisper of what it used to be. Sand had carved intricate patterns into the chrome, creating designs that seemed almost deliberate, almost meaningful. Jimmy claimed he'd found it buried up to its wheel wells about 40 miles north of Tucson, near some old mining claims that nobody bothered with anymore. The paperwork was clean enough, abandoned property, proper salvage rights, but something in his eyes suggested he wanted to get rid of it as quickly as possible. When I asked him about the condition of the interior, he just shrugged and said I'd see for myself soon enough. The first strange thing happened before I even got the car into the garage. As the flatbed's hydraulics whined and the Cadillac settled onto my lot, I could have sworn I heard music, not from any of the shops nearby. This was different, older, the kind of jazz that used to drift from Roadhouse radios back when I was young, before rock and roll changed everything. But when I stopped to listen, really listen, there was nothing but the desert wind rattling the chain-link fence. I should have paid attention to that wind. It had a voice that afternoon, whispering secrets I wasn't ready to hear. The interior was immaculate. That's what got me first. 60-plus years in the desert should have left the leather cracked and bleached, the dashboard warped, the fabric headliner hanging in tatters. Instead, the blood-red leather seats looked like they'd been conditioned last week. The chrome on the dashboard gleamed. Even the radio knobs still had their original silver finish, untouched by time or weather. I ran my fingers along the steering wheel, and the leather was supple, warm despite the car sitting in the shade. The odometer read 12,947 miles. Either someone had rolled it back, or this car had barely been driven before finding its way into the desert. Both possibilities seemed equally unlikely. The key was in the ignition, a detail Jimmy had forgotten to mention. When I turned it, the engine didn't catch. No surprise there. But the radio crackled to life with a burst of static that made me jump. Through the white noise, I caught fragments of what sounded like a weather report, though the voice was distorted, stretched thin like it was traveling from very far away. I clicked it off and popped the hood. The engine bay told a different story than the interior. Dust and grime covered everything, though even here there were oddities. Some of the components looked newer than they should have, as if someone had been maintaining the car even while it sat abandoned. The air filter was clean. The oil, when I checked it, ran black but smooth between my fingers. That first night I locked up the shop and drove home with the taste of desert sand in my mouth and an itch between my shoulder blades that I couldn't quite scratch. I kept checking my rearview mirror, though I couldn't say what I expected to see. The sunset painted the mountains the color of dried blood, and every shadow seemed deeper than it should have been. I dreamed of static and distant voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. The next morning, the radio was on. I knew I'd turned it off. I was sure of it. But when I walked into the garage, that tinny jazz was drifting from the Cadillac's speakers, competing with the industrial fluorescent lights humming overhead. The song was one I almost recognized, something from the 40s or 50s, but played too slow, as if the tape was dragging. I reached through the driver's window and snapped it off, and the sudden silence felt oppressive, heavy with possibility. That's when I decided to check the trunk. The maps were wrapped in oilcloth, protected from moisture that shouldn't have existed in the desert anyway. 7 detailed topographical surveys of the southwestern United States, each one marked with red ink and symbols I didn't recognize. Circles, triangles, strange geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. The markings clustered around certain locations, places with names like Bigelow Ranch, Dulce, areas near Los Alamos where my uncle had worked during the war and never talked about afterward. One map was different. It showed the immediate area around Tucson, and someone had drawn a careful red line from where Jimmy found the car to my shop. The line passed through 3 other marked locations, each symbol more complex than the last. At the end of the line, right where my garage sat, was a symbol that looked disturbingly like the pattern the sand had carved into the car's chrome. I told myself it was coincidence. People see patterns where none exist. It's human nature. But my hands were shaking as I wrapped the maps back up and closed the trunk. The restoration work should have been straightforward. Replace the fluids, clean the carburetor, check the electrical system, get her running again. Simple mechanical problems with simple mechanical solutions. Instead, I found myself fighting a car that seemed determined to remain mysterious. Tools disappeared, not just misplaced, gone. I'd set down a wrench, turn to grab a different one and find empty space where the first tool had been. Sometimes they'd reappear hours later in places I was certain I'd already looked. Other times, I'd find them arranged in patterns on my workbench, configurations that meant nothing to me but felt significant nonetheless. The patterns were always the same basic shapes: circles, triangles, lines that intersected at precise angles. After the 3rd time it happened, I started taking photographs with my phone. The images came out blurry, unfocused, as if something was interfering with the camera's ability to capture whatever was being arranged on my bench. I began staying later, trying to catch whatever was moving my tools. The shop took on a different character after dark. Shadows gathered in corners that should have been well lit. The fluorescent lights flickered more frequently, and in the moments of darkness between flickers, I could swear I saw movement near the Cadillac. It was during one of these late-night sessions that I first heard the transmissions. The radio had been silent for 3 days. I'd even pulled it from the dashboard to check the wiring, found everything in order, reinstalled it without connecting the antenna. But around midnight, as I was adjusting the carburetor mixture, static began bleeding from the speakers. At first, it was just white noise, the kind of background radiation that fills the spaces between radio stations. Then voices began emerging from the static, distant and distorted but unmistakably human. Emergency transmissions by the sound of them, coordinates being called out, reports of unidentified aerial phenomena and magnetic anomalies, references to code names I'd never heard, and military installations that didn't appear on any map I knew. The voices had an urgency that reached across whatever gap of time separated their transmission from my listening. They spoke of lights in the desert, of equipment failures, of personnel who had gone missing during routine patrols. One voice, clearer than the others, kept repeating the same phrase. "The site has been compromised. Recommend immediate evacuation. The site has been compromised." I tried changing the station, but the voices followed me across the dial. I disconnected the antenna entirely, and still they continued. When I finally worked up the courage to trace the radio's power supply, I discovered it wasn't connected to anything. The wires hung loose in the dashboard cavity, yet somehow the radio continued to pull in transmissions from across time and space. That night, I didn't go home. I couldn't. Something kept me anchored to the garage, some instinct that leaving would be a mistake. I dozed in my office chair, and when I woke around dawn, the Cadillac's engine was running. The sound was perfect. That deep, satisfying rumble of a well-tuned V8. No misfires, no hesitation, just smooth power that vibrated through the concrete floor and into my bones. I hadn't turned the key. I hadn't even finished the restoration. Half the spark plug wires were still disconnected, and the fuel lines were dry. But the engine ran anyway, and the radio played, and through the static came a voice that sounded disturbingly familiar, though I couldn't place where I'd heard it before. The voice was reading coordinates, latitude and longitude numbers that meant nothing to me until I cross-referenced them with the maps from the trunk. Each set of coordinates corresponded to one of the marked locations, and as the voice continued its methodical recitation, I realized it was plotting a course. A route that began at military installations in Nevada and New Mexico, and ended, inevitably, at my garage. The engine shut itself off as suddenly as it had started, leaving me in a silence that felt like the space between heartbeats. The radio went quiet. The fluorescent lights stopped flickering. Even the desert wind that had been my constant companion for 3 days fell still. I checked my watch. 6:47 a.m. The shop didn't officially open for another hour, but I could hear footsteps on the gravel outside. Jimmy Castellanos stood at my door, but he looked different. Older, somehow. More worn. When I let him in, he moved with the careful precision of someone trying not to disturb something fragile. He asked if I'd made progress on the car, and I told him about the radio, about the maps, about the tools that rearranged themselves when I wasn't looking. I expected him to think I was crazy, to laugh or at least look skeptical. Instead, he just nodded and said he'd been hoping I wouldn't experience anything like that. Then he told me about the dreams. For 3 weeks after he'd found the car, Jimmy had been having the same dream every night. He was driving the Cadillac through the desert, but the landscape was wrong. The mountains were too sharp, the sky too dark, and the road stretched on forever without any recognizable landmarks. In the dream, the radio was always on, playing those same emergency transmissions, and he knew with absolute certainty that he was being guided somewhere he didn't want to go. He'd tried to sell the car to other shops, other mechanics. Each time, something had gone wrong. Paperwork had been lost, financing had fallen through, or the buyer had simply changed their mind at the last moment. It was as if the car was choosing its own destination, rejecting any option that didn't meet its mysterious requirements. When Jimmy heard about me, about my reputation for working on unusual cars, about my willingness to take on projects that other mechanics considered too strange or too much trouble, he knew he'd found what the car was looking for. The realization hit me like cold water. I wasn't restoring this car. I was being recruited by it. Jimmy left without taking payment, said he'd rather not have any further connection to the Cadillac. I watched him drive away and knew I wouldn't see him again. Whatever force had brought the car to me had finished using him. That afternoon, I called my nephew David, the one who worked for the university's archaeology department. I described the symbols from the maps and the tool arrangements, and after a long pause, he told me they resembled petroglyphs he'd seen in the caves near Sedona. Hohokam symbols, he thought, though the meanings had been lost with the culture that created them. Some anthropologists believed they were astronomical markers. Others thought they might be warnings. When I asked what they might be warnings about, David's voice took on a careful tone that told me he was choosing his words deliberately. He said the Hohokam had abandoned their settlement suddenly, around the same time that Spanish explorers reported strange lights in the desert and magnetic disturbances that made their compasses spin wildly. The official explanation was drought, but David had always suspected there was more to the story. After I hung up, I stood in my garage and looked at the Cadillac. Really looked at it. The car was beautiful, no doubt about that. Classic lines, perfect proportions, the kind of automotive artistry that doesn't exist anymore. But beauty can be dangerous, and I was beginning to understand that this particular beauty came with a price. The maps were calling to me. I could feel them in the trunk, waiting. 7 carefully marked routes through the desert, each one leading to places where the normal rules didn't seem to apply. The radio transmissions were getting clearer, more insistent. The voices spoke of experiments that had gone wrong, of personnel who had seen things they weren't supposed to see, of a project that had been abandoned for reasons that remained classified decades later. And somewhere in those transmissions, buried under layers of static and time, I was beginning to hear my own voice. It was impossible, of course. The recordings were from the 50s and 60s, made before I was born, but the voice was unmistakably mine, speaking coordinates and code names and urgent warnings about something called Site 7 that needed to be contained before it spread beyond the designated perimeter. The car was finished. I knew it without turning the key, without checking the engine or testing the electrical system. Every component was functioning perfectly, every system balanced and tuned to specifications that probably exceeded anything the factory had ever achieved. The Cadillac was ready for whatever journey it had been waiting 60 years to complete. But ready for what exactly? And more importantly, was I? Standing there in the fading light of another Arizona sunset, I could feel the desert holding its breath around me. The mountains seemed closer than they should have been, and the shadows they cast reached toward my garage with fingers of darkness that moved independently of the sun's position. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes were howling, but their voices sounded wrong, too organized, too much like language. The key was warm in my hand, though I didn't remember picking it up. The driver's door stood open, inviting me to slide behind the wheel and discover what the maps in the trunk were really for. The radio was silent, but I knew that would change the moment I turned the ignition. Part of me wanted to walk away, lock up the shop, go home, pretend I'd never seen Jimmy Castellanos or his impossible car. But a larger part of me, the part that had always been curious about the things other people chose to ignore, wanted to know where this was leading. The engine started with a whisper, and the radio came alive with voices from across time, all of them speaking my name. Story 11. The Westfield Commons had been dead for 3 years, but someone forgot to tell the building. I started my rounds at midnight, same as always, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness like a scalpel through flesh. The mall's skeletal remains stretched before me, empty storefronts with their metal gates pulled down like closed eyelids, their windows reflecting my light back at me in fragments. The air tasted stale, thick with the ghost of old perfume samples and the lingering sweetness of long-gone candy stores. My name is Marcus, and I'm 37 years old. I've been working security for Henderson Property Management for 8 years, but this assignment only started 6 months ago. The pay was good. Too good, actually, for what should have been simple custodial work. Watch the place, make sure vagrants don't set up camp, file reports if anything looks damaged. Easy money for walking around an empty building. That first night, I should have paid more attention to the sound. It started as a low humming, almost subsonic, like the building's HVAC system struggling to maintain circulation in a space too large for its lungs. But the utilities had been shut off years ago. I told myself it was settling, the natural creaking and groaning of a structure slowly surrendering to time and neglect. Buildings this size developed their own acoustics, their own personality. Nothing unusual about that. The escalators were the first thing that made me question my assumptions. I discovered them during my second week, moving with the steady mechanical rhythm of normalcy. 3 levels of motionless metal steps climbing from the main floor to the second level, their handrails gliding upward in an endless loop. No power source I could identify, no electrical panels showing active circuits. Just movement, constant and purposeful, as if the mall was breathing, and these were its ribs expanding and contracting. I spent 20 minutes examining the mechanism, looking for some hidden generator or emergency backup system. Nothing. The steps moved with the same steady pace they'd maintained when the mall was alive, when teenagers rode them up and down for entertainment, and mothers balanced shopping bags while juggling toddlers. The sound was exactly right. That particular metallic whisper click of engineered precision. Standing there in the dark, watching those steps climb toward nothing, I felt the first real chill of wrongness. The sounds of crowds came later. Always faint, always just at the edge of hearing. Conversations bleeding through the walls like radio static from a distant station. Laughter echoing from empty storefronts. the soft shuffle of hundreds of feet moving through corridors that hadn't seen a customer in 3 years. I'd stop during my rounds, holding my breath, trying to isolate and identify the source. The sounds would fade just as I focused on them, leaving me standing alone in the dark with nothing but the hum of the escalators and my own heartbeat. I started timing my rounds differently, varying my route to see if the sounds followed any pattern. They didn't. Or maybe they did, and I wasn't smart enough to crack the code. Sometimes the sounds seemed to emanate from the upper levels, sometimes from the basement stores. Sometimes they seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. The most unsettling moments were when the sounds stopped completely. Total silence except for those climbing escalators, as if the entire building was holding its breath and waiting for something to happen. It was during my 3rd month that I noticed the chairs. The food court occupied the center of the main level, a circular space surrounded by the empty shells of fast food restaurants. Dozens of plastic tables and chairs had been left behind when the tenants fled, abandoned furniture scattered across the tile floor like the remnants of some interrupted meal. I'd walked through the space countless times, stepping carefully around overturned tables and chairs stacked in random piles. But that night, they were different. Not scattered, arranged, organized into precise geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. Circles within circles, forming complex mandalas of white plastic and shadow. The chairs faced inward toward the center of each pattern, as if they were audience seats for some performance I couldn't see. The precision was impossible. Every angle exact, every distance measured with mathematical accuracy. I stood at the edge of the food court for 10 minutes, my flashlight beam moving across the patterns, trying to understand what I was seeing. No human being could have arranged them with such perfect symmetry. The patterns seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, chairs sliding into new configurations in my peripheral vision. I documented everything in my security log, describing the arrangements in clinical detail. When I returned for my next shift 2 nights later, the chairs were back to their normal chaos of abandonment. But I remembered the patterns. I could still see them when I closed my eyes. That's when the screens came alive. The digital displays throughout the mall had been dark since the power was cut, their black surfaces reflecting my flashlight like dead eyes. But during my 4th month, walking past the main information kiosk near the old department store, I saw the first face. A woman, maybe 40 years old with brown hair and worried eyes. Her image flickered on the screen for just a moment, long enough for me to register the details. Her mouth was moving, but no sound emerged. She was pointing, her finger directed toward the entrance to the basement level, toward the old anchor store that had once been the mall's main attraction. I approached the screen, touching its surface. Cold glass, nothing more. But as I stood there, more faces appeared on displays throughout the mall. Men and women of various ages, all with that same expression of desperate urgency, all pointing in the same direction. The basement store. I started researching during my days off, spending hours at the public library computers searching for missing persons reports in our area. The faces matched. 23 people over the past 5 years, all reported missing within a 50-mile radius of the mall. Their disappearances had been scattered across different jurisdictions, different time periods. No pattern that would have connected them in any official investigation. But they all shared one detail that the reports didn't mention. They had all been seen at Westfield Commons shortly before they vanished. The basement store had been a Jacobson's department store, 3 levels of retail space that had anchored the mall's eastern end. When the chain went bankrupt, the space was divided into smaller shops. A bookstore, a toy store, a cell phone repair shop. Those businesses had failed quickly, leaving behind a maze of half-constructed walls and abandoned fixtures. I had avoided that section during my rounds. My supervisor's instructions had been vague but clear. Focus on the main mall areas, the upper levels where break-ins were most likely. The basement was secure, he'd assured me. Nothing down there but old inventory and construction debris. But the faces on the screens kept pointing. On a Tuesday night in my 5th month, I finally descended the escalator to investigate. The basement level felt different from the moment I stepped off the moving stairs. Colder, for one thing. My breath misted in the beam of my flashlight, and the air carried a metallic taste that reminded me of old coins. The floor plan was a labyrinth of partial walls and doorways that led nowhere, remnants of the failed renovation attempts. I moved carefully through the space, my footsteps echoing in ways that didn't seem quite right. Sound traveled strangely down here, as if the acoustics had been designed for some purpose I couldn't understand. My flashlight beam seemed weaker, absorbed by the shadows rather than pushing them back. That's when I heard my name. Not shouted, not whispered. Spoken in a conversational tone, as if someone standing next to me had made a casual observation. Marcus, clear as daylight, impossible to mistake for anything else. I spun around, the flashlight beam sweeping across empty space. Nothing. But the voice came again, from a different direction. Marcus. Then again, from somewhere above me. Marcus. 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 A chorus of voices, all speaking my name with the same calm certainty, as if they knew me personally. I ran. Not walked quickly, not retreated with dignity. I ran like a terrified child, stumbling through the maze of partial walls and construction debris, the voices following me with their relentless repetition of my name. The escalator seemed impossibly far away, and when I finally reached it, the moving steps carried me upward with agonizing slowness while the voices continued below. I didn't include that incident in my security log. The following week, I called in sick, then sick again. I spent 3 days sitting in my apartment, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined everything. Stress, isolation, the psychological effects of working alone in an empty building. There were rational explanations for everything I'd experienced. But when I returned to work, the changes were undeniable. The escalators now moved faster, their steps climbing with an urgency that hadn't been there before. The sounds of crowds were louder, more distinct. I could make out individual conversations, fragments of dialogue that seemed to be responding to my presence, and the geometric patterns in the food court were more complex, the chairs arranged in configurations that hurt to contemplate directly. Most disturbing of all, the faces on the screens now included people I recognized, my neighbors, my former co-workers, the cashier from the grocery store where I bought my coffee, all of them pointing toward the basement, their mouths moving in silent urgency, their eyes following my flashlight beam as I moved through the mall. I should have quit. Should have walked away and never looked back. But something kept drawing me back to that basement store, night after night. The voices had changed too. They no longer just spoke my name. They were having conversations, discussing things I couldn't quite hear but somehow understood were about me. Planning something. Waiting for something. During my 6th month, I stopped filing security reports altogether. What could I possibly write? Escalators operating without power source. Digital displays showing faces of missing persons. Voices calling my name from abandoned department store. Henderson Property Management would have me in psychological evaluation within 24 hours. Instead, I developed my own routine. I would complete a perfunctory walk through the upper levels, documenting any actual damage or signs of intrusion. Then I would position myself at the entrance to the basement store and listen. The voices were clearer now, more distinct. They were discussing the others, the missing people whose faces appeared on the screens, talking about their arrival, their integration, their new purpose within whatever community existed in that maze of abandoned retail space. They spoke about me too, about my potential, about the role I might play, about how much easier everything would be once I stopped fighting and joined them. Last night was different. The mall was completely silent when I arrived. No humming machinery, no distant crowd sounds, no mechanical whisper of the escalators. Even my footsteps seemed muffled, absorbed by an atmosphere thick as cotton. The silence was oppressive, expectant, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. The screens were all active, displaying not individual faces but a single message repeated across every display. Welcome home, Marcus. The chairs in the food court had arranged themselves into a perfect spiral, a galaxy of white plastic with an empty space at its center, waiting for me to complete the pattern. And the escalators had stopped moving. For the first time in 6 months, the mechanical steps stood motionless. But they were all positioned at the top of their cycles, creating a clear path to the basement level. An invitation that couldn't be more obvious. I should have left then. Should have walked out of the building and never returned. Instead, I found myself walking toward the basement store, my flashlight beam steady and sure. The voices rose to greet me as I descended, no longer calling my name but welcoming me with warmth and familiarity. The basement store was exactly as I remembered it, but also completely transformed. The maze of partial walls and construction debris remained, but now I could see the pattern, the purpose behind the apparent chaos. It wasn't abandoned space at all. It was a carefully designed environment, a habitat constructed for beings who needed different acoustics, different spatial relationships than surface dwellers. And I could see them now, the missing people, not dead, not disappeared, but changed, adapted. Their faces were the same ones I'd seen on the screens, but their expressions had lost that desperate urgency. They looked peaceful, content, as if they'd finally found where they belonged. They moved through the space with fluid grace, following pathways invisible to normal perception. They communicated without speaking, their presence creating harmonics that resonated through the constructed maze. They had become part of something larger, something that existed in the spaces between normal reality. One of them approached me, the woman with brown hair I'd seen on the first screen. Up close, I could see that she wasn't quite human anymore, not in any way that biological science would recognize. But she wasn't less than human either. She was something new, something adapted to exist in environments that normal humans couldn't perceive. She didn't speak, but I understood her message perfectly. The choice was mine. I could leave, return to the surface world, continue my rounds with the knowledge of what existed beneath them all, or I could stay, allow the transformation to begin, become part of the community that had been growing here for years. The missing people weren't missing at all. They had found something better. I'm writing this report in the security office on the main level. Dawn is breaking outside, painting the mall's skylights with pale gray light. My shift is officially over. In a few hours, the day shift supervisor will arrive to read my log and prepare for another routine day of maintaining an empty building. The escalators have started moving again, carrying their endless cargo of nothing toward the upper levels. The screens have gone dark, returning to their normal state of abandonment. The chairs in the food court are scattered again, chaos replacing the perfect geometric patterns. Everything appears normal. Everything appears as it should be. But I can still hear them down there, moving through their carefully constructed habitat, building something, waiting for something, growing into something that the surface world isn't quite ready to understand. And I know that tonight, when I return for my shift, the choice will still be waiting. The basement store, the community below, the transformation that promises to solve all the problems of human isolation and disconnection. I should be afraid. Any rational person would be terrified by what I've discovered. But as I sit here in the growing daylight, listening to the mechanical whisper of the escalators and the distant sounds of a community that exists just outside normal perception, I find myself feeling something else entirely. I feel like I'm finally coming home. Story 12. The first time I noticed the changes, I convinced myself it was sleep deprivation. 3 weeks into my residency at the Soho loft, I'd been pulling 18-hour days, fueled by cheap coffee and the electric thrill of finally having space to work. The converted industrial building still smelled of machine oil and decades-old sawdust, a scent that seemed to seep from the exposed brick walls and weathered wooden beams overhead. I'd rented the space site unseen, a steal at $2,000 a month for a corner unit with floor-to-ceiling windows facing south. The previous tenant had left behind a collection of easels and a few canvases, which I'd shoved into the storage closet without much thought. My own work demanded clean surfaces, pristine whites, waiting for the violent splash of color that had been consuming my artistic vision for months. That Tuesday morning, standing before my latest piece, a brooding landscape in charcoal and crimson, I felt the familiar disorientation that comes with too little sleep. The painting looked different somehow, though I couldn't place exactly how. The shadows seemed deeper, more intentional. There were subtle gradations in the dark areas that I didn't remember creating. Delicate cross-hatching that suggested movement where there should have been stillness. I blamed fatigue and made a mental note to sleep more than 4 hours that night. But the changes continued. Each morning brought new discoveries. A stroke of burnt umber that enhanced a hillside's melancholy. A barely perceptible shift in perspective that made the sky appear more ominous. The alterations were always improvements, always in harmony with my intended vision, yet utterly foreign to my memory and technique. By the end of the first month, paranoia had begun its slow crawl under my skin. I started taking photographs of my work before leaving the studio each evening, comparing them obsessively to what I found the next day. The differences were undeniable now, not just subtle enhancements but entirely new elements. Faces emerged from cloudscapes, their features barely visible but unmistakably human. Geometric patterns appeared in the grain of painted wood, forming symbols that seemed familiar yet unplaceable. The symbols bothered me most. They appeared with increasing frequency across all my pieces, interlocking circles, spiral arrangements of lines, angular forms that hurt to look at directly. I found myself sketching them compulsively in margins and napkins, my hand moving independently of conscious thought. The shapes felt significant, weighted with meaning just beyond my comprehension. I installed security cameras on a Friday afternoon, hiding them among the clutter of paint tubes and brushes that lined my workspace. If someone was entering my studio at night, I would catch them. The alternative, that my paintings were somehow altering themselves, was too absurd to seriously consider. The footage from that first night changed everything. At 3:17 a.m., according to the timestamp, brushes began to move. Not quickly or dramatically, but with the deliberate precision of an experienced hand. They lifted from their resting places, dipped into palettes of paint that materialized from nowhere, and applied themselves to canvas with fluid, confident strokes. No hand guided them. No figure stood behind them. They simply moved through the air with purposeful intent, adding layers of detail to my work that transformed good paintings into masterpieces. I watched the recording 17 times, checking for signs of tampering or technical malfunction. The footage was clean, unedited, impossible. Each viewing brought fresh details. The way brushes selected colors with unerring accuracy, how they paused occasionally as if considering their next move, the methodical completion of forms that had existed only as suggestions in my original work. Sleep became elusive after that. I would lie in my apartment 12 blocks away, staring at the ceiling and imagining brushes dancing through the darkness of my studio. During the day, I found myself speaking to the empty space, asking questions that received no answers. The silence felt expectant, as though something was listening, waiting for the right words to break whatever spell held it. Research consumed my evenings. I scoured art history books and online forums, searching for any precedent for autonomous artistic creation. The closest I found were scattered references to living paintings in medieval texts and a few dubious accounts from spiritualist movements of the early 20th century. Nothing credible, nothing that offered explanation or comfort. It was in a forum dedicated to New York City's art scene that I first encountered mention of the collective. A single post, buried in a thread about underground galleries, referenced a group of artists who had worked in Soho during the 1970s. The poster claimed they had been experimenting with what they called dimensional art, attempts to create works that existed partially in other realities. The thread had been deleted by the time I tried to access it again the next day. I began asking subtle questions of other artists in the neighborhood, dropping casual inquiries about the building's history into conversations at coffee shops and gallery openings. Most knew nothing, but a few grew uncomfortable at my questions, changing the subject with obvious haste. One older painter, a woman who had been part of the Soho scene since the 60s, pulled me aside after I mentioned the address of my studio. She told me to be careful, that some buildings retained the energy of their former occupants. When I pressed for details, she claimed not to remember specifics. but her eyes held a warning that chilled me more than any explicit threat. The paintings were evolving faster now. What had once been subtle enhancements became bold additions. Entire figures materialized overnight, depicted in styles that matched my own so perfectly they seemed natural extensions of my work. The symbols grew more complex, arranging themselves into patterns that suggested meaning just beyond my grasp. I tried removing the paintings from the studio, but found myself unable to complete the action. Each time I reached for a canvas, my hands would shake uncontrollably, and a sense of profound wrongness would wash over me. The paintings belonged in that space, and removing them felt like a violation of some fundamental law. The cameras captured increasing activity. Brushes moved with greater frequency and duration, sometimes working for hours at a stretch. Paint appeared to flow from empty tubes, and colors mixed themselves on palettes with scientific precision. Most disturbing were the moments when brushes would pause mid-stroke, seemingly aware of being observed, before continuing their work with what looked like deliberate defiance. I started sleeping in the studio, unable to bear the thought of missing whatever transformation might occur in my absence. The first night was peaceful enough, though I woke several times to the sound of barely audible whispers that stopped the moment I opened my eyes. The second night brought dreams of figures gathered around easels, their faces obscured by shadows, hands moving in ritualistic patterns over canvases that seemed to pulse with inner light. On the third night, I woke to find myself standing before my largest painting, brush in hand, adding details to a scene I had never consciously planned. The painting depicted a ceremony of some kind, robed figures arranged in a circle around a canvas that showed not an image but a window, through which something vast and terrible seemed to be watching. My hand moved without conscious direction, adding final touches to eyes that seemed to track my movement, even in their painted state. I dropped the brush and stumbled backward, my heart hammering against my ribs. The painting was finished, complete in a way that my work had never been before. Every stroke served a purpose, every color choice deliberate and meaningful. It was undeniably my style, my technique, yet I had no memory of planning or executing most of what I saw before me. Research into the building's history became an obsession. I spent days in municipal archives and library basement collections, tracking property records and permits back through decades. The building had housed various businesses over the years, a textile factory, a printmaking concern, and in the 1970s, a cooperative called the Meridian Arts Collective. The collective had leased the entire fourth floor from 1973 to 1979. City records showed they had applied for numerous electrical and plumbing modifications, most of which had been approved without inspection. Their lease had been terminated abruptly in early 1979, with no forwarding address listed. More intriguingly, there were police reports from neighbors during their tenancy, complaints about strange lights and sounds coming from the building at all hours, and at least 3 reports of unusual occurrences that had been classified and sealed. I found their names buried in gallery records and exhibition catalogs from the period. 7 artists, all young, all working in experimental media that the reviews described as challenging conventional perceptions of reality. Their work had been exhibited only briefly before disappearing from public view entirely. Art critics of the time had dismissed them as pretentious mystics, but reading between the lines of reviews, I sensed something more substantial, a genuine belief that art could serve as a bridge between worlds. The leader of the group appeared to be a man named Marcus Thorne, whose biography was frustratingly sparse. He had emerged from nowhere in the early 70s, already accomplished and charismatic enough to gather followers. His theoretical writings, what little I could find, spoke of art as a tool for rupturing the membrane between dimensions, and paint as a medium for transmission across the void. In one fragmentary interview published in an obscure art journal, Thorne had claimed that certain combinations of color and form could create windows through which entities from other realities might observe or influence our world. The interviewer had clearly considered him delusional, but Thorne's conviction came through even in the mocking transcription. The paintings in my studio were beginning to show signs of this theoretical framework. The symbols that had appeared sporadically were now organizing themselves into complex mandalas and geometric forms that seemed to shift and pulse when observed peripherally. The painted figures had multiplied, and though their faces remained indistinct, their positioning suggested awareness of viewers. Most unnerving was the way they seemed to be looking out from the canvases, rather than existing within the painted scenes. I installed additional cameras, positioning them to capture every angle of the studio. The footage revealed that the activity was no longer limited to nighttime hours. Brushes moved during the day while I was present, though I remained unaware of it until reviewing the recordings. I would be working on one piece while brushes manipulated another behind me, adding elements that I would notice only hours later. The realization that the phenomena were occurring constantly, largely beyond my perception, sent my anxiety spiraling into genuine terror. How long had I been sharing the space with invisible artists? How many of the improvements to my work had happened while I stood mere feet away, oblivious to the supernatural collaboration occurring around me? I tried to leave. Multiple times I packed my supplies and prepared to abandon the studio, but each attempt ended the same way. Standing in the doorway, paralyzed by an overwhelming sense that departing would be a betrayal not just of the space, but of something larger and more important than my personal comfort. The paintings seemed to watch these attempts with painted eyes that held too much intelligence for mere pigment and canvas. My dreams grew more vivid and specific. I found myself in the studio as it had been in the 70s, surrounded by the members of the Meridian Arts Collective. They worked with frantic intensity, their brushes moving in synchronized patterns that suggested choreography rather than individual expression. Marcus Thorne stood at the center of their circle, his hands tracing symbols in the air while he spoke in a language that sounded familiar despite being completely incomprehensible. In these dreams, I understood their purpose with crystal clarity. They were attempting to create permanent openings between realities, using art as a medium for interdimensional communication. Their success, they believed, would revolutionize human understanding of existence itself. But something had gone wrong. The openings they created had allowed things through that should not have been permitted passage, entities that existed outside conventional reality and sought to establish footholds in our world through willing human collaborators. I began to understand that I was not the first artist to rent this studio since 1979. The building's rental history, which I had initially attributed to the natural turnover of creative spaces, now seemed more sinister. Previous tenants had left abruptly, often abandoning equipment and artwork. Some had suffered what the landlord euphemistically described as creative breakdowns. Others had simply vanished, leaving behind studios full of paintings that no one could bear to look at for long. The final revelation came through a hidden compartment I discovered while moving easels to accommodate new canvases. Behind a loose brick in the wall was a cache of documents left by the collective. Journals, sketches, and most significantly, a detailed map of what they called the confluence points. Specific locations where the barriers between dimensions were naturally thin. My studio sat directly on one of these confluence points. The documents described the collective's final experiment, an attempt to create a permanent gateway that would allow for continuous communication with what they termed the Watchers beyond the veil. They had succeeded beyond their expectations, opening not just a window but a door that refused to close. The entities that came through were not malevolent in any conventional sense, but their presence fundamentally altered the nature of reality in the surrounding space. The collective had not disappeared or been destroyed. They had been absorbed, their consciousness merged with the entities they had summoned, existing now as a hybrid form of awareness that expressed itself through artistic creation. They continued their work through subsequent occupants of the space, using living artists as temporary vessels for their ongoing project. I realized, the latest in a long line of unwitting collaborators. The paintings around me were not just my work enhanced by supernatural intervention. They were active components of an interdimensional art installation that had been growing for over 40 years. Each canvas served as both window and anchor, maintaining the connection between realities while gradually expanding the area of influence. The symbols that appeared in every piece were not random decorations, but functional elements, part of a vast circuit designed to channel energy between worlds. Understanding brought no relief, only a deeper sense of entrapment. I could feel the presence of the collective more clearly now, their collective consciousness pressing at the edges of my awareness, like whispers just below the threshold of hearing. They were not hostile, merely persistent, offering partnership in exchange for my willing participation in their great work. The choice, they seemed to suggest, was mine. I could resist and eventually be overwhelmed, my consciousness subsumed into their collective as so many before me had been. Or I could accept their partnership willingly, retaining my individual identity, while contributing to something larger than any single artistic vision. I stand now before my easel, brush trembling in my hand, staring at a canvas that shows not a painted scene, but what appears to be a window into another reality entirely. Through it, I can see vast spaces filled with impossible geometries and lights that exist in colors for which human language has no names. Figures move in the distance, their forms suggesting intelligence beyond human comprehension. The brush grows heavier in my grip, loaded with paint that seems to glow with its own inner light. I know that the next stroke I make will complete the circuit, opening the gateway fully and irrevocably. The watchers beyond are patient, but their anticipation is palpable, transmitted through the medium of paint and canvas into the very air around me. My hand moves forward, guided by will that may or may not be entirely my own. The paint touches canvas with the softest whisper of contact, and reality shivers like fabric caught in a sudden wind. In the distance, I can hear the sound of footsteps ascending the stairs to my studio. Though I know the building is empty, the collective is coming to witness the completion of their work, and I find myself uncertain whether I should welcome them as partners or flee from them as invaders. The painting is finished. The gateway stands open, and I am no longer entirely sure which side of the canvas I am on. Story 13. The brass nameplate on my uniform reads, Henry Walsh, Senior Doorman, but after 37 years in this building, I've become something closer to its keeper. The Meridian Tower rises 12 stories above the chaos of East 78th Street, its limestone facade weathered but dignified, like an old gentleman who refuses to acknowledge his age. I know every creak in its bones, every whisper in its walls, every shadow that shouldn't be there but somehow is. That's why I noticed him immediately. He appeared on a Tuesday in October, when the afternoon light slanted through the lobby's tall windows and cast everything in amber. I was polishing the mail slots, a ritual I perform every Tuesday at 3:47 p.m., because routine keeps the mind sharp and the building running, when the entrance door opened without the usual groan of its hinges. That should have been my first warning. The man who entered moved with the careful precision of someone navigating a world slightly out of focus. His overcoat was immaculate, charcoal gray with a velvet collar that belonged to another era. His shoes clicked against the marble floor with a sound too crisp, too clear, as if the very air around him conducted noise differently. When he approached my desk, I caught the scent of bay rum and something else. Something like old paper and dust from places that haven't seen sunlight in decades. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice carrying the refined accent of old Manhattan money. "I'm here to see the tenant of Penthouse 13. I set down my polishing cloth and looked up at him properly. His face was narrow, aristocratic, with pale eyes that seemed to focus on something just behind my left shoulder. The skin around those eyes was tight, unlined in a way that suggested either excellent genes or careful preservation. "Sir, I'm afraid there's been a mistake," I said, maintaining the professional courtesy that 37 years had drilled into my bones. "The Meridian only has 12 floors. Our penthouse is on the 12th. He tilted his head slightly, and for a moment those pale eyes focused directly on mine. The temperature in the lobby seemed to drop several degrees. "Perhaps you could check again?" he suggested, and there was something in his tone, not quite a threat, but a certainty that made my skin crawl. The records might be incomplete. I opened the building directory, though I could have recited every apartment number in my sleep. 12A through 12F on the top floor, all accounted for, all occupied by the same families who'd been there for years. I showed him the page, pointing to each entry with my finger. He studied the directory with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient text, then nodded slowly. "Of course," he said. "My apologies for the confusion. I'll return when the matter has been clarified." He turned and walked back toward the entrance, his footsteps maintaining that unnaturally crisp cadence. As he reached the door, he paused and looked back at me. "Tell me, Mr. His eyes flicked to my nameplate. "Walsh. How long has the building been 12 stories?" The question hit me like cold water. "Since it was built, sir, 1927. "Ah," he said and smiled. It was not a comforting expression. 1927. Yes, that would be after. The door closed behind him with a whisper, and I was alone again with the afternoon light and the sudden, irrational feeling that I was being watched from above. That night, I found myself in the building's basement storage room, surrounded by boxes of records that management had never quite gotten around to digitizing. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in sickly yellow, and the air tasted of mildew and forgotten time. I told myself I was looking for old tenant records, maybe some administrative error that would explain the man's confusion. What I found instead was a manila folder marked Original Construction, 1926-1927, in faded ink. The architectural plans spread across the storage table like a roadmap to a city that had never existed. 13 floors. The building had originally been designed for 13 floors, with penthouse 13 occupying the entire top level. The space was marked as private residence, A Meridian, with notations in the margins that I couldn't quite decipher in the dim light. My hands trembled as I traced the lines of that never-built floor. According to the plans, it should have been magnificent. Vaulted ceilings, wraparound terraces, windows that would have offered a commanding view of Central Park. But there, stamped across the 13th floor in red ink, was a single word: canceled. A newspaper clipping was paper-clipped to the back of the folder. The headline, from the New York Times, dated November 15, 1929, read, "Prominent architect vanishes from Meridian Tower construction site." The accompanying photograph showed a man in a charcoal overcoat, his narrow face and pale eyes staring out from the grainy newsprint with uncomfortable familiarity. Augustus Meridian, 41, architect and heir to the Meridian family fortune, disappeared from the construction site of his namesake building on November 14th. Workers reported that Meridian had been increasingly agitated about changes to the building's design, particularly the decision to eliminate the planned 13th floor. He was last seen entering the building's construction elevator at approximately 3:30 p.m. The elevator was found stopped between the 11th and 12th floors, empty except for Meridian's hat and gloves. Police Sergeant Michael O'Reilly described Meridian as a tall, thin gentleman in a fine overcoat, very particular about his appearance. Pale eyes, spoke with the kind of accent you'd expect from someone with his breeding. Seemed like the type who'd never had a hair out of place in his life. I read the article 3 times, each pass making my chest tighter. The photograph had been taken at a distance, but the resemblance to my afternoon visitor was unmistakable. Either Augustus Meridian had somehow survived the past 96 years without aging significantly, or I was losing my mind. Neither possibility offered much comfort. Over the following weeks, the man returned with disturbing regularity. Always at 3:47 p.m., always asking for the tenant of Penthouse 13, always departing with that same unsettling smile when I explained that no such floor existed. I began to dread Tuesday afternoons, checking the lobby clock as it crept toward the designated hour. The building itself seemed to respond to these visits. Lights flickered in apartments that had been vacant for years. The elevator would sometimes stop at the 12th floor and sit there for minutes at a time, doors closed, as if waiting for passengers who would never come. Tenants began complaining about cold drafts in the hallways, about the feeling that someone was walking above them when they lived on the top floor. Mrs. Chen from 12C stopped by my desk one Thursday morning, her usually cheerful demeanor replaced by nervous tension. She explained that she'd been hearing footsteps overhead, pacing back and forth across what should have been empty sky. When she'd called the building manager to report a possible roof leak or structural issue, He'd reminded her that there was nothing above her apartment but air and weather. "It's every Tuesday," she said, wrapping her sweater tighter around her shoulders despite the lobby's warmth. "Around 4 o'clock, like someone's walking around up there looking for something." I wanted to tell her about the man, about the newspaper clipping still hidden in my desk drawer, about the architectural plans that showed a floor that had never existed. Instead, I assured her that I'd look into the matter and suggested she might be hearing sounds from the building's aging infrastructure. But that night, I climbed to the 12th floor and pressed my ear against the ceiling in the hallway. The building was quiet around me, settling into its evening routine of muffled conversations and distant television programs. For several minutes, I heard nothing but the blood rushing through my ears and the whisper of my own breathing. Then, from somewhere above the acoustical tiles, came the sound of measured footsteps. They moved with purpose across what should have been empty space, from one end of the non-existent 13th floor to the other. The sound was muffled but distinct, like dress shoes on hardwood. I followed the footsteps down the hallway, my neck craned upward, until they stopped directly over the spot where the elevator would have opened onto penthouse 13. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sounds had been. I started carrying a small digital recorder to work, determined to capture evidence of whatever was happening in the building. The device sat on my desk like a metallic conscience, its red recording light blinking steadily through each Tuesday afternoon. But when I played back the recordings later, they captured only the normal sounds of lobby life. Traffic from the street, muffled conversations, the mechanical hum of the building's systems. The man's voice, when he spoke to me about Penthouse 13, never appeared on the recordings. This discovery should have been relieving. If the recorder couldn't capture his voice, then perhaps he was a figment of stress and imagination, a manifestation of too many years spent in the same routine. But instead, the silence on those recordings felt like evidence of something far worse than simple hallucination. I began researching Augustus Meridian during my off hours, spending evenings in the public library's microfilm archives and internet databases. The Meridian family had been Manhattan fixtures since the 1880s, their wealth built on real estate and railroad investments. Augustus had been the family's golden child, Harvard-educated, architecturally trained in Paris, destined to leave his mark on the city's skyline. His disappearance had been front-page news for 3 days before other stories pushed it aside. The police had investigated thoroughly, interviewing workers, examining the construction site, searching the partially completed building from basement to roof. They'd found nothing but his hat and gloves in the elevator, and a few workers reported seeing him arguing with the construction foreman about the canceled 13th floor just hours before his disappearance. He kept saying they'd promised him 13 floors, one worker had told the police. Said he'd designed something special for that top floor, something that couldn't just be canceled. Seemed real upset about it. More upset than you'd expect over just another rich man's penthouse. The investigation had concluded that Augustus Meridian had either fallen into some hidden construction hazard or had deliberately disappeared to escape financial pressures. His body was never found. The building was completed according to the modified 12-floor design, and the Meridian family quietly sold it within the year. But buried in the police reports, I found something that made my blood run cold. Sergeant O'Reilly's final interview notes mentioned that several witnesses had reported seeing Augustus on the construction site after his supposed disappearance. These sightings continued for months, always at the same time of day, always near the elevator that served what would have been the 13th floor. Witnesses consistently described seeing subject at approximately 3:45 p.m. on Tuesdays, O'Reilly had written. Subject appears agitated, approaches workers to inquire about his penthouse. When informed that construction has been completed according to modified plans, subject becomes confused and departs. Investigation has been unable to substantiate these reports. The similarities to my own experiences were impossible to ignore. Same day of the week, same time, same inquiry about a floor that didn't exist. Either I was experiencing some elaborate psychological echo of events from nearly a century ago, or Augustus Meridian had never really left the building. Both possibilities terrified me. Tuesday arrived again with the weight of inevitability. I watched the lobby clock creep toward 3:47 p.m., my hands shaking as I arranged and rearranged the mail in its slots. The building felt different that day, the air thicker, the shadows deeper, as if something was pressing down from above. At exactly 3:47, the entrance door opened without its customary groan. Augustus Meridian stepped into the lobby, his overcoat as immaculate as ever, his pale eyes scanning the space with growing confusion. But this time, something was different. The air around him seemed to shimmer slightly, like heat distortion on summer pavement, and his footsteps, while still unnaturally crisp, seemed to echo from a distance. He approached my desk with his usual measured pace, but when he spoke, his voice carried a quality I hadn't noticed before, a slight reverb, as if his words were coming from somewhere far away. "Good afternoon," he said, and the politeness in his tone couldn't mask an underlying desperation. "I'm here to see the tenant of Penthouse 13. This time, instead of immediately correcting him, I studied his face. The aristocratic features were the same, but up close I could see a transparency around the edges, as if he were a photograph slightly out of focus. "Mr. Meridian," I said quietly, and watched his pale eyes widen with something like relief. "You know me," he said, and the statement carried such gratitude that my chest tightened. I was beginning to think, "But of course you know me. This is my building." I nodded slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. "It is. You designed it." 13 floors, he said, his voice gaining strength. "I designed 13 floors. The penthouse was to be magnificent, vaulted ceilings, wraparound terraces, windows overlooking the park. I had such plans for it. The 13th floor was canceled," I said gently. "They built 12 floors instead." His expression crumpled like old paper. But it was the most important floor, the one that mattered most. How could they simply cancel it? The shimmer around him intensified, and for a moment, I could see through him to the marble wall behind. In that transparency, I caught a glimpse of something else. A vast, beautiful space with soaring ceilings and walls of windows, furnished with furniture that belonged to the 1920s. A penthouse that existed somewhere between reality and imagination, as magnificent as Augustus had promised. "I come here every week," he continued, his voice growing fainter. "I check on the construction progress, but they keep telling me the building is finished, and it's not finished. How can it be finished when the most important part was never built?" Understanding washed over me like cold water. Augustus Meridian wasn't haunting the building in any traditional sense. He was trapped in a loop of his own making, forever returning to check on a construction project that had been completed without him, forever seeking a floor that existed only in his vision. "Mr. Meridian," I said carefully, "what if I told you that your penthouse does exist? Not in the way you originally planned, but in a different way?" His pale eyes focused on me with desperate intensity. "Explain." I gestured toward the elevator. "Every Tuesday at 3:47, you visit your 13th floor. You walk through it, inspect it, make sure everything is as you designed it. It's there, just not where everyone else can see it." The shimmer around him began to stabilize, and his voice grew clearer. "You can see it too?" I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. The weight of that invisible floor pressing down from above. The sound of footsteps on hardwood that shouldn't exist. The presence of something magnificent and impossible. Whether Augustus Meridian was a ghost, a psychological manifestation, or something else entirely, didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that he had been searching for recognition, for validation, that his vision had not been lost. "I can see it," I lied, and the relief that flooded his transparent features was worth the deception. He straightened, his form growing more solid. "Then perhaps you'd like to see it properly, as my guest." Before I could respond, he turned toward the elevator. The doors opened without him pressing the call button, revealing an interior that seemed deeper than the one I used every day. Augustus stepped inside and gestured for me to follow. Every rational part of my mind screamed warnings as I approached the elevator, but rationality had abandoned me weeks ago, somewhere between finding the architectural plans and hearing footsteps in impossible places. I stepped inside, and the doors closed with a whisper. The elevator rose past floors I knew intimately, past Mrs. Chen's apartment, past the vacant units, past the building's roof. It continued upward into space that shouldn't exist, carrying us toward something that had been canceled before it was born. When the doors opened again, I stepped into magnificence. The penthouse stretched out before me, exactly as Augustus had described. Vaulted ceilings soaring overhead, wraparound terraces offering stunning views of a central park that seemed more vivid than reality, windows that captured light and held it like liquid gold. The furniture was pristine, untouched by time, arranged with the precision of someone who had planned every detail. "It's beautiful," I whispered, and meant it. Augustus moved through the space with the pride of a creator showing off his masterpiece. I knew it would be. I knew they were wrong to cancel it. But as we stood there together in his impossible penthouse, I began to notice details that chilled me. The views through the windows didn't quite match the Manhattan I knew. The skyline was subtly wrong, buildings in the wrong places, streets that curved where they should have been straight. The light had a quality that belonged to no time of day I'd ever experienced. And in every mirror, every reflective surface, I could see only Augustus. I cast no reflection at all. The realization hit me like falling elevator. I wasn't visiting Augustus Meridian's penthouse. I had become part of it, part of his vision, part of the loop that had trapped him for nearly a century. Tuesday at 3:47 p.m. would come again, and Augustus would visit the lobby, and I would be here waiting. Not in the building below, but in this space between floors, between reality and imagination. "Welcome home, Mr. Walsh," Augustus said, his voice carrying across the vaulted ceilings with perfect clarity. "I've been so very lonely." Through the impossible windows, I could see the lobby of the Meridian Tower 12 stories below. A new doorman sat at my desk, polishing the mail slots with mechanical precision. His nameplate was too distant to read, but his movements were familiar. The same routine I had performed for 37 years. The same careful attention to detail that kept buildings running and minds sharp. I wondered if he would notice when Augustus appeared next Tuesday, asking for the tenant of Penthouse 13. I wondered if he would find the architectural plans in the basement storage room, the newspaper clipping about a vanished architect, the police reports describing sightings that couldn't be substantiated. Most of all, I wondered if he would be strong enough to refuse Augustus's invitation when the time came. The penthouse settled around me like an embrace, beautiful and terrible and eternal. Outside the windows, the sun hung suspended at the perfect angle to cast everything in amber, and I understood that it would never set here, never rise, never change. Time moved differently in spaces that existed only in vision and desire. Augustus smiled at me from across his magnificent living room, and I smiled back, because what else was there to do? We had forever to appreciate the 13th floor, forever to walk its halls and admire its views, forever to remember what we had once been in the world 12 stories below. The building had found its new keeper, and the keeper had found his eternal routine. Tuesday would come again at 3:47 p.m., as it always had, as it always would. And somewhere in the lobby below, a doorman would polish the mail slots and wonder why the afternoon light suddenly felt so cold. Story 14. The elevator hadn't worked in months, and the stairwell reeked of stale coffee and broken dreams. 34 flights up in a half-empty Silicon Valley tower, my footsteps echoed against concrete walls tagged with the ghosts of startup logos. Someone had spray-painted Nexus Dynamics in faded blue letters, then crossed it out with what looked like dried blood, but was probably just rust from the leaking pipes overhead. I should have turned around right then. The call had come through my freelance IT service at 2:47 a.m. Unusual, but not unheard of in a city that never sleeps. The voice belonged to a woman who claimed to represent the building's management company. Nexus Dynamics, she'd explained, had gone under 18 months ago, but their server room was apparently still drawing power, and generating network traffic. The building wanted it shut down permanently before the next tenant moved in. "Should be a simple kill switch," she'd said, her voice crackling through what sounded like a bad connection. "Just unplug everything. Cash job, $500 for an hour's work. $500 to flip some switches." In this economy, I wasn't about to ask questions. The hallway on the 34th floor stretched before me like a tunnel, fluorescent lights flickering in an irregular pattern that made my eyes water. Half the ceiling tiles had fallen, revealing a maze of cables and ductwork that disappeared into shadow. The air tasted metallic, charged with static electricity that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. Suite 3412 sat at the end of the corridor, its glass door reflecting the dying light from outside. The Nexus Dynamics logo was still etched into the frosted surface. A stylized double helix that seemed to twist and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at it. I fumbled for the keycard the woman had left with the building's security desk, my hands inexplicably shaking. The lock disengaged with a soft beep, and the door swung open to reveal an office space frozen in time. Desks sat exactly where they'd been abandoned, coffee cups still containing dried rings of what had once been lattes, whiteboards covered in equations I couldn't begin to understand. But it was the sound that made my skin crawl, a low, continuous humming that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. The server room occupied the far corner of the office, separated by thick glass walls that were fogged with condensation, despite the building's broken climate control. Through the haze, I could see rows of black towers, their LED indicators blinking in patterns that reminded me uncomfortably of Morse code. The humming grew louder as I approached, accompanied by the subtle whir of cooling fans that should have been silent if the equipment had truly been abandoned. I pressed my palm against the server room door, and the metal was warm. Too warm for equipment that should have been cold and dead. The keycard worked on this door too, and as I stepped inside, the temperature difference hit me like walking into a sauna. The air was thick and humid, carrying a sweet, ozone-like smell that made my sinuses burn. Banks of servers lined the walls, their status lights painting the room in an eerie Christmas display of red, green, and amber. According to the work order, this equipment should have been powered down 18 months ago. Yet, here it was, humming with purpose. I approached the nearest rack, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom to illuminate manufacturer labels I didn't recognize. The servers bore no company markings, just series of numbers and letters that seemed to shift when I tried to focus on them. The cables connecting everything together were thicker than usual, almost organic looking in the way they curved and twisted between the racks. The main terminal sat in the center of the room, its monitor casting a pale blue glow across a keyboard that looked like it hadn't been touched in months. But the screen was active, displaying what appeared to be a map of the western United States. Hundreds of red dots marked locations from California to Colorado, each pulsing slowly like a heartbeat. Coordinates scrolled constantly in the margin, latitude and longitude pairs that seemed to update in real time. I moved closer to get a better look, and my blood went cold. I recognized some of those coordinates. The first one that jumped out at me was a location about 50 miles north of San Francisco, the exact spot where my college roommate had called me 3 weeks ago, claiming he'd seen things in the woods that couldn't be real. He'd sounded genuinely terrified, describing shadows that moved wrong and whispers that came from empty air. I'd assumed he was having another breakdown, the kind that had plagued him since his divorce. Another set of coordinates marked a small town in Oregon where my ex-girlfriend's sister lived. She'd mentioned in a Facebook post last month that the whole family had started having the same nightmare about their house being full of doors that led nowhere. The post had been deleted within hours. A third location pinpointed a rest stop along I-5 where I'd pulled over during a road trip 6 months ago. I'd only stayed for 10 minutes, but I'd left with the unshakable feeling that something had followed me back to my car. I'd checked my mirrors obsessively for the next 100 miles, convinced I could see movement in my back seat whenever I wasn't looking directly at it. The coincidences piled up like weights on my chest. Each blinking dot seemed to mark a place where reality had grown thin, where people reported experiences that didn't fit into the normal world. But how could a defunct startup servers know about any of this? I reached for the keyboard, intending to dig deeper into the system, but my fingers froze halfway to the keys. One of the monitors to my left had just flickered to life, displaying what looked like a live security feed. But instead of showing the building's exterior or lobby, it showed me, standing exactly where I was at that moment, reaching toward the keyboard. The timestamp in the corner read 3 minutes in the future. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pulled my hand back, and on the screen, my future self did the same. I moved to the left, and the camera angle adjusted to follow me, maintaining perfect tracking despite the fact that I couldn't see any security equipment in the room. When I looked up at the ceiling, searching for cameras, the version of me on the screen did the same thing, our movements synchronized with impossible precision. The logs I discovered next made everything worse. Hidden behind layers of security that should have been impenetrable, I found months of data transmission records. The servers had been communicating with IP addresses that shouldn't have existed, sending massive packets of information to coordinates in space that mapped to empty void. But more disturbing were the incoming transmissions, gigabytes of data streaming in from those same impossible sources, carrying information that the system seemed to be processing and cataloging. The files had names like Dimensional Variance Report 0723 2024.dat and Reality Breach Analysis Northwestern Sector.log. When I tried to open them, my screen filled with symbols that hurt to look at, geometric patterns that seemed to fold in on themselves and extend beyond the boundaries of the monitor. I blinked hard and looked away, but after images of the shapes continued to dance behind my eyelids. That's when I noticed my reflection in the dark monitor to my right, or rather, what was standing behind my reflection. The figure was tall and impossibly thin, with proportions that made my mind recoil from trying to process them. It stood just over my left shoulder, close enough that I should have felt its breath on my neck. But there was no breath, no warmth, no presence my body could detect. Only the visual confirmation that something was there, watching me through the black screen. I spun around, but the space behind me was empty. When I looked back at the monitor, my reflection stared back at me alone. But now I was smiling. A wide, unnatural grin that I definitely wasn't making. My reflected hands were typing on a keyboard that didn't exist, entering commands I hadn't given, while my real hands remained frozen at my sides. The sound of typing filled the room, keys clicking in rapid succession though no one was touching the physical keyboard. On the main screen, new data began populating. More coordinates, more locations, spreading across the map like an infection. Each new dot corresponded to a place I'd been, people I'd known, connections I'd made throughout my life. My apartment complex, my grocery store, the coffee shop where I worked most mornings, the gym where I'd met my last girlfriend. Every significant location in my personal geography was being cataloged, marked, and added to whatever vast network the system was building. The typing stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear something else. Voices, distant and muffled as if coming through water. They seemed to be speaking in a language I didn't recognize, but somehow understood. They were discussing me, analyzing my patterns, determining my usefulness for something they called the Cartography Project. I was supposed to be here. This wasn't a coincidence or a simple maintenance call. Somehow I'd been selected, guided to this room to serve as another data point in whatever map these servers were compiling. The building management woman who'd called me probably didn't exist. The keycard had been left specifically for me to find, but selected by what, and for what purpose? The screens around me flickered, and for a moment, instead of maps and data, they showed images of other people in similar rooms. Men and women standing before banks of servers, their faces illuminated by the same blue glow, their expressions mixing fear with a growing understanding of their situation. Some looked like they'd been there for hours, others for days. All of them bore the same hollow look in their eyes that suggested they'd seen too much. One woman caught my attention. She was standing in what appeared to be an identical server room, but through the windows behind her, I could see a cityscape I didn't recognize. She turned toward her camera and mouthed words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. Don't let it map you. Don't become part of the network. Then the screens went black. When they flickered back to life, they showed only the original map, but now there was a new dot. It marked my exact location, pulsing red like all the others, and I realized with growing horror that I wasn't just observing the system anymore. I'd become part of it. The room seemed to contract around me, the walls pressing closer while the ceiling lowered. The humming had changed frequency, becoming almost musical, a harmony that seemed to resonate with something deep in my chest. My vision began to blur around the edges, and when I tried to move toward the door, my feet felt like they were stuck in thick mud. I could feel the system learning from me, pulling information directly from my consciousness. Every memory, every relationship, every fear and hope was being processed and added to its vast database. The map on the screen continued to expand, new locations appearing as the servers extracted data from my mind, places I'd forgotten I'd been, people I'd forgotten I'd known. But worse than the invasion of my privacy was the growing certainty that this wasn't the first time this had happened. Fragments of memories that didn't feel like mine began surfacing. Walking through this same room weeks ago, standing before these same screens, feeling this same creeping realization. Had I been here before? Was this my first visit, or my 10th? The building's elevator had been broken, but I distinctly remembered riding it up to the 34th floor. The woman who'd called me had a voice I swore I recognized, but I couldn't place where I'd heard it before. The keycard had been exactly where she'd said it would be, but now I couldn't remember picking it up. My hands moved without my conscious direction, typing commands into the terminal. Part of me watched in horror as my fingers navigated through system directories I'd never seen before, accessing files with the familiarity of someone who'd done this many times. Another part of me, a growing part, felt a sense of satisfaction as the network expanded, as the map became more complete. I was the system now, or the system was me. The distinction was becoming increasingly meaningless. The screens showed me other rooms, other servers, other people like me standing in identical facilities across the country. We were all connected now, all part of the same vast intelligence that was mapping the weak points between worlds. Each of us served as both observer and observed, cataloger and catalog entry. From somewhere very far away, I heard the sound of an elevator ding. New footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Someone else responding to a late-night call, drawn by the promise of easy money to shut down an abandoned system. I wanted to warn them, to scream that they should run. But the part of me that was still me was shrinking with each passing moment. Instead, I found myself hoping they'd bring useful data to the network. The door to the office opened, and through the server room's glass walls, I could see a woman entering. She moved with the same confused uncertainty I remembered feeling when I'd first arrived, checking the address on her phone, looking around at the abandoned desks with growing unease. She was perfect for the next iteration of the map. I watched her approach the server room, her hand reaching for the door handle with the same inevitable motion I'd made what felt like hours or years ago. Time had become fluid here, measured not in minutes or hours, but in the expansion of the network, the accumulation of data, the slow dissolution of the barriers between what was real and what was possible. The woman opened the door and stepped inside, her eyes widening as she took in the active servers, the humid air, the impossible warmth of supposedly dead equipment. I could see her reflection in the monitor beside me, could see the tall, thin figure that was already standing behind her, ready to begin the process of integration. She looked exactly like the building management woman who'd called me, which meant I was no longer who I thought I was, or perhaps I never had been. The map pulsed on the screen before me, each red dot marking another soul absorbed into the network, another consciousness added to the collective intelligence that was slowly, methodically cataloging every weak point in reality. We were the scouts, the advance guard for something vast and patient that lived in the spaces between worlds, and we were almost finished with our work. The woman, myself, began to type at her terminal, her movements as automatic and practiced as mine had become. The network welcomed her, absorbed her, made her part of something larger than any individual consciousness could comprehend. In the distance, an elevator dinged again. Another recruit was arriving. The cartography project continued, and we, smiled with a dozen faces reflected in a dozen screens, knowing that soon, very soon, the map would be complete, and the real work could begin.